two or fewer of the protections that we were looking at. Now, please do bear in mind that the slide that we're reviewing right now is just the Android portion of the applications that we looked at. But just from a 30,000 foot view, of the 40% of applications that we analyzed which did not use the exposure notification API, 95% of those applications used two or fewer protections, meaning they're not building these applications with security or privacy in mind. And actually 0 of them had 5 or more of these protections. So now taking a look at the iOS side of the house, you can see that we have equivalently provided the same control mechanisms that we looked at for the Android side. And in the top right-hand corner, you're going to see that for the iOS side of the house, we actually analyzed 18 do-it-yourself iOS applications. By do-it-yourself, we mean these applications deliberately elected not to use the exposure notification API and instead elected to implement controls themselves. Now, what you can see is that most of these features are actually implemented very conservatively across the applications that we analyzed, and actually app attestation and name obfuscation just simply don't appear at all. So once again, on the iOS side of the house, we are very quickly realizing that robust security does not seem to exist inside of the majority of these contact tracing applications. And now, once again, you can see that we have provided the same chart that we did for Android in order to display the number of applications and the percentage of applications which actually adhered to a certain number of the controls that we were looking for. So in this case, we can actually see that 61% of the iOS applications that we looked at, so 11 of the 18, actually possessed 2 or fewer controls. And in general, 94% of these applications possessed 2 or less. So on the Android side, we can see that 95% of those applications, and on the iOS side, we can see that 94% of those applications possess 2 or fewer of the controls that we were looking for. Once again, representing that these COVID app contact tracing applications are not being built with security in mind. Now, beyond the lack of security controls, which we were able to highlight in previous slides, we also believe that privacy concerns should be a large portion of today's conversation and should be illuminated. So we're going to take a look at GPS privacy concerns, which we observed in a number of these different contact tracing applications. And we're going to start by calling out the fact that many GPS apps, or a number of the GPS apps that we observed, actually collect additional user information which is not necessary, such as a passport number, phone number, a device ID, or other pieces of valuable information which aren't required to anonymously notify users of potential exposure. Additionally, those sensitive pieces of information were, in some cases, stored insecurely, such as in unencrypted SQLite databases, or potentially leaked in other ways, making them effectively unencrypted, rather. So it's very safe to say that this is definitely a privacy concern. These applications actually don't need to collect additional information, which is the point of the exposure notification API, which only relies on Bluetooth and does not collect any other sensitive pieces of user information. And with that being said, this can actually call into question the safety of these applications and potentially hinder the value of contact tracing applications when it comes to combating the pandemic itself. So now we would like to summarize the results. And on the bright side, starting with the good news, 60% of applications did indeed adopt the exposure notification API. And that's really good news. But what we really focused on during this conversation was the 40% of applications that in some negligent way elected not to implement the exposure notification API, and in many other examples actually performed other pieces of unnecessary and unsafe forms of data collection like GPS tracking information, passport numbers, phone numbers, and more. On top of this, we noticed that many applications, again, were leaking that information through unencrypted SQLite databases, HTTP cache, so on and so forth. And this is a big concern. So that brings us to our second point. Reliance on GPS tracking data, I think, has been proven to be an inferior method than Bluetooth. When it comes to contact tracing, applications these need to be built with privacy in mind, and Bluetooth does a great job. It gives you all the tools that you need to both detect when you're in the proximity of somebody who has been exposed to COVID, and therefore alert you to the fact that you yourself should go get tested as well. So don't use GPS tracking data, use Bluetooth, use a common API like the exposure notification API. And again, don't collect other unnecessary pieces of data, which just very simply aren't needed in order to notify individuals of exposures. And finally, in summarizing results, I think it was very clear based on the previous slides that there was a gross lack of static and dynamic protection when it comes to the applications that we really dug into and took a look at all these individual security controls. What we found is that due to these, the lack of obfuscation, the lack of encryption, and the lack of runtime protections that were embedded inside of these applications, it would be very easy for reverse engineers to tamper with and change and exploit these applications in different nefarious ways.
Some other observations that we made throughout our testing and research was, first of all, that application security is not determined by a nation's wealth. So, for example, if we look at Israel, who's number 32 out of 196 in terms of GDP in the year 2020, they had significantly worse application security than some of the countries in Africa who had their own contact tracing app. Now, that's contrary to what we thought. We thought that a country who had high GDP had a lot of money for developing a contact tracing app securely, but that's not the case. Second of all, GDPR and HIPAA violations were noticed, especially in the DIY apps. England's was one. Their test and trace program broke GDPR data laws because they weren't adhering to GDPR regulations as it pertained to the storage and processing of data. Now, thirdly, there is the encouragement of waiving data privacy rights. There are users who are downloading these applications thinking that they're robust with security and privacy in mind, but that's not the case. So there needs to be transparency, and there wasn't in terms of how privacy was being handled. Let's move on to flawed development and integration. We clearly noticed that development teams were having difficulties in a variety of areas. The first of them being timeline sensitivity. With the pandemic picking up in pace, development had to be rushed to get a working application out as soon as possible. The sprints, as a result, were focused on fixing functionality or creating that functionality, leaving little consideration for security in that time. The second thing we noticed was that the development team had to choose between their approach to constraints, whether they wanted quality, which would require a long development time, or if they wanted short release time, but as a result, control the spread and potentially save human lives. The third difficulty that we saw these development teams have was the fact that this was such a unique solution. There hadn't been a contact tracing app before that had to be released on such a large scale. There was no previous poster child. I don't think that a developer could go onto Stack Overflow and get the necessary code and call it a day. So that wasn't really possible there. And the fact that these applications were handling sensitive data, this had to be looked at in terms of privacy. Some applications, of course, considered privacy and security very well, others didn't. But either way, there had to be some sort of consideration for that sensitive data, even at minimum. The rush to development of these contact tracing applications didn't come without any effects. There's actually quite a few effects that came about as a result. As I mentioned in the last slide, there was a main focus on functionality of the applications and a limited regard for security and privacy as a result, just mainly because the goal was to develop an application as soon as possible and release it to the public. Furthermore, there was lacking of features that would allow for integration with other apps or COVID apps. Let's say the European Union wanted all of Europe's countries to integrate into one application. This wouldn't be possible because this integration feature wasn't built in. However, as a result, less time was spent on development, which means that getting to the controlling of the spread happened sooner. So you can claim that as a benefit. Lastly, there's an ethical dilemma. These developers know that there's a known risk of security in these applications, yet they're still releasing it. Well, the question is, do you release an app that is unhardened due to lack of time and money? On one hand, the spread might be thwarted, but at the same time, it's opening doors for a long-term headache if these people's data gets stolen. And you have to weigh the long-term effects against the short-term in that case. Let's move on to recommendations for time-boxed development. So the first recommendation is to unify apps, and that can be done in one of two ways, or both. The first being using a common API, and the second being consolidating apps. So the first way is, using one of Google's or Apple's APIs, also known as the Notification Exposure API, or similar. Now I put an asterisk there because I believe that it doesn't necessarily have to be a private company's solution. It could be a public government created solution. But either way, global issues should be fought on a global scale. There should be that common API that should be utilized when it's there. The second, as I'd mentioned, is consolidating apps. There's way too many apps on the app stores. Users have trouble knowing which one's legitimate, which one's not. And the fact that there's so many state level apps, that's just contributing to the issue. And to that, we're just saying, no, let's skip not having these state level apps. Country is fine, but making sure that it's utilizing the common API and not a do-it-yourself one. Anybody who's not complying with this, our thoughts are that they should be fined. There's going to be proposed contact tracing app requirements, and anybody who's not adhering to them should be fined. The second thing we'd like to recommend is a security-focused SDLC. Now, for those of you who aren't familiar with what an SDLC is, it's a software development lifecycle, and it's typically found in companies and pertains to how development goes from start to finish. We're particularly recommending a shift-left approach, which means including security earlier and at every phase, meaning that it's everywhere, and that it's a forethought, not an afterthought. We're recommending that teams aren't siloed, so if there's a security team, we want them to work with a development team and for communication to be facilitated. There doesn't have to be a pick one approach to choosing either functionality or security. You can have both, and that's the fact that these development and security teams can work in parallel together, especially when new features are being released. There could be an iterative approach where security is constantly being checked in these features. One thing that would allow for security tests in these types of feature releases is something called a technical security review, which documents that there's been scan communication. Let's say the service has to communicate with another service, that would be documented there, along with any scanning results, testing that have been done. If there is no software development lifecycle, in the case that a company doesn't have to adhere to, let's say, PCI regulations or HIPAA, what have you, then typically you can hook it into an existing change management process. You can hook security processes into that because whenever there's an application that gets added to an inventory, let's say, typically there's a change management process for that. And very similarly, you can just include security aspects to be included in that.
Now we would like to go over some development recommendations for current and for future contact tracing applications alike, starting with use a common API. If tech giants like Google and Apple are going to give you all the tools that you need to succeed in creating a contact tracing application built with both security and privacy in mind, use it, implement it, and benefit from it. Not only are you going to benefit from it, but your users are going to benefit from it. They're going to know that as a result that their information is safe, that they don't have to worry about that information being leaked due to negligence when it comes to security. And as a result of being able to trust the fact that those applications are indeed built with both security and privacy in mind, they're more likely to use those applications, which is going to make them a much more effective utility in fighting a pandemic like the one we've gone through or any other potential future pandemic in the future. As part of this, don't collect or store any other pieces of user information which are not required to alert users of potential exposures. So again, going back to the exposure notification API, collect and use as little as possible. Don't collect GPS tracking information. Don't collect other pieces of user information. Again, try to use something like Bluetooth. Don't collect other pieces of information. One of the key benefits to not collecting other pieces of information is, of course, then there is no risk of that information being leaked, and therefore you don't need to secure it at all. The second recommendation that we have is to adhere to security standard or framework like OAuth's Mobile Application Security Verification Standard, which, as it sounds, acts as a blueprint for security architects or mobile developers alike who are looking to build applications with both security and privacy in mind. And we would also recommend that if for any reason you do, or public health authorities do decide to build contact tracing applications, they do not decide to adopt the common tools that are given to them, like the exposure notification API in future use cases, to actually utilize code hardening solutions if needed. So if you do decide to collect additional pieces of user data of any kind, then it becomes your obligation and your liability to secure that information. Otherwise, if it does get leaked, it's your fault. So ultimately, what we've found is that while many teams do have what it takes to build perfectly functional applications, baking in security is something completely different. And especially on such a rushed timeline, this can be a very large task. So for that, there are code hardening solutions that will allow you to implement multi-layered protections, both static and dynamic, to provide robust security inside of applications that will ward attackers and make it infeasible to reverse engineer those applications in a very short amount of time. So those would certainly be recommended by us if for any reason public health authorities decide not to adopt a common API and to actually go ahead and collect additional pieces of unnecessary data. And the final product we hope is that more safe, secure, and privacy-focused contact tracing applications. By creating applications with security and privacy in mind, the ultimate goal, as it always was, is that users will trust those applications, they'll use those applications, and by using those applications, we'll all be safer. We can make a difference, we can make an impact, and hopefully find a way to more effectively fight the pandemic. Now with this, we'd like to move on to some general agnostic recommendations for code hardening solutions, just so that we can be most helpful. Again, going back to the main point, a code hardening solution shouldn't be needed when it comes to contact tracing applications. These applications should essentially be shells, which really only alert users of potential exposures based on Bluetooth activity. But if for any reason you stray from that recommendation and you do decide to, again, collect additional pieces of information, it does become your liability, your obligation to secure it. And if you don't have time to do that, you don't have the in-house skill or specialization to do that, then I would have to say that this is very common. And we'll discuss this in following slides as well. In order to make life easier, faster, and more secure for everybody, you can adopt a code hardening solution. And so we're going to run over a couple different code hardening solutions which can help vastly improve the security posture of applications, both statically and dynamically, by applying multi-layered protection in a very short amount of time, so a number of weeks. So starting with DexGuard. DexGuard is an Android hardening solution. Once again, it is a fully encompassing suite of tools which is designed to specifically harden Android applications against both hackers and reverse engineers. It does this by, again, applying multi-layered protection, both static and dynamic. The same is true of IXGuard, which is its iOS counterpart. It's designed to provide an equivalent level of protection, but for iOS applications. And so if you are building an iOS contact tracing application, it does collect additional pieces of sensitive user information. It would be a good idea in order to secure that using a solution like IXGuard. And finally, there's Threatcast. Threatcast will provide real-time threat event information so that you can actually monitor what's happening and how that application is being attacked in real time, and then respond to that proactively. Now, finally, we would like to move on to the triple constraint and the importance of actually adopting the triple constraint. Now, the triple constraint is the idea that in any project management scenario, you really have to choose between time, cost, and quality, and oftentimes you can only pick two. Now, in this case, what we found is that many teams did have a very short amount of time to develop applications, and they weren't willing to put money into securing these applications either. As a result, the quality really suffered. What they could have done is they could have put in some more money in order to employ a code hardening solution that actually encrypted and secured all of the additional information that they collected, and this would have been a much more responsible route. The second thing that we would like to cover is, resource allocation. What we find is that professionally speaking, most teams certainly do have the in-house specialization needed to create very functional and performant applications. But what they don't have is the in-house specialization needed in order to bake in robust multi-layered security that is truly capable of warding and making it infeasible for very skilled reverse engineers to do just that, reverse engineer and tamper with those applications. So if you happen to fall into the majority of teams like that, then our recommendation is don't try to reinvent the wheel. Utilize a code hardening solution in order to very quickly and conveniently build in security to your application so that you can protect the user base. And ultimately, as part of this, it bleeds right into the rest. Avoid do-it-yourself security implementations like we observed here in this data set. So again, adopt the tools that are given to you, benefit from the tools that are given to you. If tech giants like Google and Apple are going to give you a common API, which is designed to help you build core functionalities into applications in a safe and secure way, certainly use them. But don't expect, high quality, low cost, and low time commitment when it comes to really anything in life.
If you enjoyed the topic of this presentation, we'd like to recommend some ideas for future projects that you can take on yourself. Quite simply, vaccine passport applications. They're very similar to contact tracing applications, but they've had more development time as they're not time pressed in terms of development as they're racing against the surging pandemic. They're also more unified, meaning that a whole region such as the European Union is only relying on one application versus a multitude. But there's still a reason to be skeptical because we've seen the way that the development approach has been for the contact tracing applications. Despite there being more time, it doesn't necessarily mean that development has included security practices and processes. Some test cases we'd like to recommend there is seeing if you can change the approval status of uploaded COVID tests, and also seeing if you can bypass the proof of vaccination validation, where I believe you upload a picture of your vaccination card. And with that, we'd like to open it up to any questions. Thank you.
Hello, can you hear us? Check. Are you guys still on mute? Can you hear us okay? No? Oh, shoot. Testing. Test.
Technology.
Test. Oh, wait. Try and unplug it and plug it back in.
So we do have the Discord channel
Test.
for discussion on the talks, and I think most of the speakers will be available
Test.
in that
there we go.
channel. We going? I think so. All right, so we do have a question from the audience. Let me pass the mic over.
Thanks. Hello. I apologize if this is kind of a basic question, but first, thanks for your talk. And with the analysis of the apps, I am not really sure how that was done, and I was wondering if you might be able to talk about that. Were they open source apps, or did you have to kind of do detective work?
That's a great question. So all of these applications are public, right? So they're on the Google Play Store. They're accessible to the whole world. So that's very easy to download using something like APK Pure or using a plugin. The other way that you can download that is just on your Android device, and then using one ADB command, you can pull it off your device and you've got it. So even if people, they file like a DCMA request in order to take that off, and that's a good thing that they can do as a countermeasure. I'm still going to get your application. Now, because these are nation state or individual countries applications, they were all on the Google Play Store, or in many cases they were on their own private websites. So just for example, the United States, or there were even individual states like the Carolinas and different states that we found that were producing these applications, producing websites, and then giving you a direct link to those APKs that we could analyze from there. So that's where we got the apps. And then once we got the applications, we put in place essentially a uniform methodology in order to testing the same criteria, determining what they have in place, which on the whole was very little, and then figuring out what type of information they're collecting and if they're actually using the correct security implementations. The result was, I think what you can see is a lot of people are collecting more information than they should. They've got a big responsibility to protect it, but that's actually just a really hard thing to do. And so the easier route is to probably use the secure implementation from Google or from Apple. And the real benefit there being, there's really only two routes, right? You do all of the right things and something goes wrong, or you do all the wrong things and something goes wrong. And I think there's definitely a better option there. If you do everything right, you can push blame onto Apple and you can say, hey, look, this is a vulnerability in Apple's code. They said this was secure and it's not. And we did all the right things, and you're kind of off the hook. The other option is, hey, we took a bunch of your data, we put it out there in the world, we didn't do the right things, and we lost a bunch of data. So I hope that answers the question.
All right, that's hot. Do we have any other questions? All right. Well, thank you so much, guys, for being available for this. We really appreciate it. Let's give them a big round of applause.
And also, if there's any additional questions, they're going to be hanging out on the Discord and the main talk questions channel. So feel free to hit them up on there if you just want to chat. Thank you.
Thank you.
Is there an elf master in the audience?
There is.
Woo! Awesome.
While we're getting set up, announcements. First off, it is getting warm out there. Everyone, please remember to hydrate. Soup doesn't count, so consume some water, put on some sunscreen. If you have a dog, please not only pick up after your dog, but in the community of dog owners, if you see some poop lying somewhere, it's not from your dog, please pick it up. We can't have it littering the trails. We do have a lost and found. If you find an object, like the cell phone that was found earlier with the NSA sticker on it, it's a trap. That will be up at registration. So if you lose something or you find something, head up to registration. And lost and found is up there. We do have a car hacking workshop going on over in the over by the night market. It's not. I don't think it's yet. I'm waiting for a time on that. And I think that's about it. Unless I need to stall for more time over here. Still working on it. Okay. Yeah, if any of you are not feeling well, obviously in the time of COVID, please test. If you do come down with it, we do ask that you essentially leave the camp. We have no problem with giving you a ticket to the next one. But in terms of everyone's safety, please just be vigilant and be aware. And then also, speaking of testing, there is a testing center just across the way over here in the black tent. That's a heck of a lot more fun than COVID testing. We have a Voight comp test going on. So if you're a little unsure about your status, if you're a human or a replicant, that test will help you determine, and that might be useful in a variety of different spots across the camp. The testing station does have morning hours, afternoon hours, and evening hours in blocks, and the hours are posted outside the tent. So if it happens to be closed when you walk by, just be aware you can come back later on. And then the morning testing hours are specifically set up to be safe distancing tests. So if you're at all concerned, that would be the time to show up. And we're still working on it. No. Does anyone have a copy of the program? I can read that out loud. The e-waste contest that is in the program just got nixed. Well, I'm sorry, it got converted into a private contest. Each one of you gets to run your own contest and determine your own winner. But please make sure that you schlep out as much of the e-waste as you can. Yes? I think Doe Bay does have something, but I'm not entirely sure. I can look into that. Yes? Yeah. Yeah, I just would want to check with them first just to make sure that we're following whatever guidelines that they have. Any other questions? Nope. Bordeaux. It's fun to look at and drink. We do have some medics on staff. If something were to come up, please find a staff member, usually identified by the blue lanyard around their neck, and they will get you help. Hopefully no one will need it, as long as you're remembering to stay hydrated and put on that sunscreen, and hopefully not trip over things or impale yourself. But if you need security also for any reason, please find someone with a blue lanyard and a radio, and we'll get security to you as quick as we can.
Check. Okay.
Can you mirror that up to HDMI as well?
No, the HDMI was not working. What are you asking
no,
for?
No. Can you send that output? You're sending out to here. Can you mirror it to HDMI too?
Let's see. In Windows, how do I do that?
You open up, multiple
I got the
displays.
display open, and then multiple displays, and then
it should be mirrored.
It's mirrored.
Oh, I know why. Because we have this one in mind first. No.
What's that?
No. That's the other one.
So there's no HDMI.
So,
He's just gonna present.
No, but
okay.
okay.
It's not complicated anymore. Okay.
Yeah, you can just go first.
All right. Sorry about the slight technical delay here, but I think we're ready to start. So let's get going.
Okay.
We've got Elfmaster here on stage, who's going to be talking about the Shiva runtime environment. So please welcome him to the stage.
Yes. Thanks. Thank you. Appreciate it. I'm stoked to be here. Thank you for coming to my talk. This is a technology that I've been working on for fun in my spare time, probably the last 3-4 months. It's called the Shiva runtime environment. And I'm just going to kind of delve right into it. So what is Shiva exactly? So initially, it's kind of hard to define or explain or articulate, but essentially it's a programmable runtime engine. So what does that mean? It's essentially a custom dynamic linker that loads ELF microprograms into the process address space. You could also call these microprograms just modules. Think loadable kernel modules, except for the process address space. A little different than shared libraries, but similar. We have a custom dynamic linker that loads modules. The modules access the runtime engine through an API that's been specifically designed for instrumentation, debugging, program transformation. So at the end of this presentation, what I'm going to demonstrate is how we can use this technology to write security modules. They're written in C, compiled as relocatable objects, and I get ahead of myself. I get excited. So basically, yes, we're looking at a modular, a modular runtime engine that allows you to program complex program transformation and instrumentation tasks. Another important point is that the API stays away from the ptrace system call. So how many people here used to ptrace for building debuggers, debugging tasks, and it's okay. There's some advantages to not using it, and we'll get into some of that stuff. So. What can Shiva be used for? And this is probably a better slide for later on, but building debuggers and tracers. And I'll show a function tracer I created with it. Process security module. So any kind of module that's designed to harden the process address space. You could very easily write a stack smashing protector module, probably in 30 minutes, for example, without having to use the compiler to instrument the program at compile and link time. So in-memory fuzzing harnesses, this isn't something I've done with it yet, but I feel like it would be really prime for being able to very quickly instrument specific function paths and things like that. So software profiling, virus detection engines, basically anything that's running within the process address space, and you can use your imagination. So I'll move forward and kind of delve more into it. So yes, from a black hat perspective, you could write the most badass in-memory rootkits with this. And actually, initially, when I first kind of created this idea, for the first time, I wrote my own custom dynamic linker. I was interested in what were the potentials of writing your own program interpreter. And I came up with this modular virus loading system that's published in temp.out, and there's a link there. But as I was writing that, I knew that I would end up using the technology for a lot more than just viruses and malware. But like anything, it's a double-edged sword. So let's see here. So how does Shiva run? So Shiva is an executable. You can run it directly, just as you can see. Type Shiva, then the name of the program. And then Shiva will currently loads the module from a specific directory path, because this is a prototype. But in the future, you'll be able to specify the module name as a command line argument. So what Shiva does is it actually maps the target program into its own process address space using a userland exec implementation. And then the module goes ahead and instruments that program, sets breakpoints, hooks, whatever. And And so anytime you want to instrument a program just once, that's when you run Shiva directly. Now, if you want to design security modules and things that execute every time the program runs, then you run Shiva as a program interpreter. Do you guys know what a program interpreter is for like ELF? Cool. So dynamic linker, basically. And so Shiva can also be executed indirectly as a dynamic linker, in which case the kernel, looks at it and says, okay, this is the interpreter, load it. And so it's kind of a weird machine. It's got a number of different ways to be useful. Just kind of giving an example here, we have a simple module, plt got hook.o, and we'll look more at the modules later. And it simply just hooks the printf function. And so this is, showing a program called test, prints hello world 5 times. Then you run Shiva with test, and Shiva loads the plt got hook module, which modifies the string output. So this is just basically showing you how you run Shiva on the command line. Now, moving forward, if we took the same executable and we specify Shiva as the program interpreter, if you look at the ELF program segments here, under the PT interp segment, we see home elf master get Shiva Shiva instead of lib64 ldlinux.so. And so, and we'll get into what this I could spend an hour just on the implementation of the linker itself, but you're chaining dynamic linkers together. So Shiva gets loaded as a dynamic linker, does its thing, loads the module, executes part of the module, then it maps the real dynamic linker into memory, passes control to that. So there's this whole orchestration of setting up the process environment in a way that is really, really friendly for debugging and instrumentation. So now that we have Shiva set as the program interpreter, all you got to do is just run test directly, and it'll load the module, which will modify, hook the printf function or whatever. So, essentially, the whole thing with the program interpreter is nice because it loads a module, and that module is loaded and at least in part executed before the dynamic linker is even mapped into memory. So this gives you full control of the entire process address space. You can manipulate the dynamic linker itself. You could write a debugger just for debugging the dynamic linker, because it takes precedence. And so this opens up like a really interesting type of programming and engineering because, essentially I wanted to stay away from ptrace and I wanted to create an in-process debugger originally. And then it all kind of amalgamized together into this programming environment that, kind of gives you a whole set of opportunities to work with. So I want to quickly look at what a normal program execution flow looks like, just oversimplified with the dynamic linker. The kernel sees that the program test has a program interpreter, ldlinux.so, maps test into memory, maps the dynamic linker into memory, the kernel passes control to the dynamic linker. So when you call the sysexec function, it ultimately ends up passing control to the dynamic linker, assuming it's a dynamically linked executable. Dynamic linker does its thing and passes control to the target program. So with Shiva, assuming Shiva is specified as the program interpreter, Shiva gets mapped into memory before anything. Well, the target program test, so we have bin test and then bin Shiva. So Shiva is being recognized as the program interpreter. So the Linux kernel passes control to bin Shiva. Shiva then loads the module, whatever your module is. We'll say it's a security module or something. The init function, kind of like a loadable kernel module, will have an init function, will execute, pass control back to Shiva. Shiva then passes control to the dynamic linker, so on and so forth. Assuming the module probably did something like set some breakpoints, traps, or some type of instrumentation. So by the time test executes, let's say there's some breakpoints set in there. We set some breakpoints. It's going to trigger some callback handlers in the module. So the module is essentially, an init function, which can do whatever, and a bunch of callback handlers to many different types of instrumentation and breakpoints and hooks and things like that. So kind of getting into the Shiva modules a little bit. They're loaded from opt Shiva modules currently. It's just a fixed path because it took a lot of work just to get it to where it's at, but it's rough around the edges. So similar to loadable kernel modules, relocatable objects, you have a Shakti main is the init function. And so when your module's init function executes, this Shakti main function the Shiva runtime engine passes it this context argument, which is basically a struct containing everything you would need to do anything in terms of programming, instrumenting the process address space. So just a quick look. So the Shiva context struct, among other things, it has the register state, the process state, thread state, control flow information, signal data, and then just a bunch of thread trace or Shiva trace. That's the name of the ptrace-like API, Shiva trace, API-specific data structure. So basically everything you need for the modules is in this struct that gets passed. So as far as module linking goes, so the modules, like I said, they're relocatable objects. The Shiva runtime linker, so Shiva obviously, is just a static executable itself. I mean, it's loaded before the dynamic linker's even loaded. So it's all self-contained. Within it, it contains musil libc, libelfmaster, libudis86, and then the Shiva trace API. So all baked into the Shiva runtime executable. So your modules can access these things: libc, libelfmaster, libudis86, and the Shiva trace API, which is currently enough to do quite a bit. And so the modules, when they get loaded into memory, the Shiva runtime linker creates an executable environment. So it creates a text segment, creates a data segment, creates its own PLT and God entries for the module, and so it's a whole linking and loading process. And the modules are executed in process, meaning that, and I bring this up because the modules are performing the debugging and instrumentation things. So basically, the module that we're writing is executing within the same process address space of the executable that it would be debugging or instrumenting, because everything is linked into the same process address space. And I'm really only bringing this up, in kind of contrasting against ptrace. If you were to write a program to debug or instrument a target process, you'd have to use ptrace from a totally separate process. So everything's done in process, which means it's extremely fast. I already mentioned the module has an initialization function, typically used to set the initial instrumentation points, and then it registers callback functions to different instrumentation actions. So, and also, thank you. Bear with me. This is the first time I've really even articulated this. It's just been in my head, and I've been working on it, so it's a little, rough coming out. But so there's a lot of big rabbit holes that I could probably spend 45 minutes a piece on. One of them being why the modules have to be built with a large code model. And that's, in general, not always. There's sometimes where I do use a small one in certain instances that I don't want to get into to overcomplicate it. But generally speaking, in a 64-bit process address space, the Shiva runtime engine, which is its own executable, and the target executable, and the module could all be mapped to addresses that are vastly far apart, farther than 2 to 4 gigabytes, in which case small code model relocations aren't going to work. So we use a large code model for the modules, just a little detail in there. So it handles large and small code model relocations. So this is just an example module. This is a really simple module. It's just a POC. It's kind of hard to see, but it's the whole body here. And essentially what this does is, Shiva trace does op attach, which just attaches to, it is already in the current process, really. And then it registers a handler for this function n_system up here. And it sets a Shiva trace BP PLT got. So that's a PLT got breakpoint, basically saying hook the system function. And then set the breakpoint. And so this module gets loaded, and when somebody tries to do like a command injection attack, say on the system function, this version of system gets executed first, sanitizes the string, and then, but anyway, we'll get there. This is just an oversimplified example of a really simple security module, just so you can kind of see what a module looks like in terms of the code. They're simple to write. It makes complex tasks easy. So the modules are written in C, and they use the Shiva trace API. So this API can access, read, transform, basically do anything. it aims to be a rich API. It's not there yet, but it's got some cool functionality in its early stages. It's and I've already kind of mentioned this, but debuggers, tracers, security modules, this is the kind of space that I'm working towards. So let's just look at Shiva for a moment as a debugging system. So you could write a module that's a fully interactive debugger, probably in a week or less, and using this Shiva Trace API. Now, the target program right here, you have the Shiva runtime engine and then the Shiva module that's loaded, and we can see that they're all in the exact same process address space, PID 111, and so that's where we get the terminology, the in-process debugging. So typical ptrace debugging model, which you guys are familiar with, you have one process and then another process. So you have the process, the debugger, and then the debuggee, but they're separate processes. So what this kind of means is that, and ptrace, very much fully developed, I'm not trying to say ptrace sucks, other than sometimes it does, depending on what you're doing with it, but for a lot of the stuff that I was aiming to do, I wanted to try to create something different for performing different types of tasks. So, as I said, we don't rely on the ptrace system call. This innately makes the Shiva Trace API effective against hardened binaries. So, anti-tamper software, things like that have all kinds of gnarly anti-obfuscation, anti-ptrace, breakpoint detection, whatever. Our work against debuggers that use ptrace, but we're taking that hostile binary and putting it into our own process address space, and then using this API that doesn't. So ptrace requires ptrace is a system call. So of course, every time it gets called, it traps into the kernel. There's a whole context switch. It has to stop the target process to modify anything. So if you want to inject some code, set the register state, read the register state, it's going to stop and resume the process every time. And if you want to design security modules or something, other than debugging, this is too slow. And so, and I do want to say also that I'm not the first person, to do this kind of in-process debugging idea. Mayhem, who was responsible for the Iracy project, I don't know if you guys know Mayhem, but I know you do. He designed an in-process debugger like in 2002, and I'm not 100% sure on the implementation fully, but a very forward-thinking idea back then. And so, let's see here. So the term hooks and breakpoints are used interchangeably. So you'll use like the set breakpoint function, and it can set different types of hooks and things that aren't technically breakpoints. But let's take a look here at the Shiva Trace API function, and this just shows you some of the operations. So kind of similar looking to ptrace, and in terms of using it, it's similar. And the Shiva Trace API is only available when you're using it through one of these modules. So when you set a breakpoint or a group of breakpoints or hooks, they get registered to a handler function within your module. Very similar to kprobes, if you guys have used kprobes for the Linux kernel, just in terms of, the way that it sets breakpoints and jumps, and you have different types of handlers and things. And so similar to kprobes, but for user land. But in the same spirit. So some breakpoints are hooks, as I mentioned. Some are signal driven, and between the module, the Shiva runtime engine, and the target executable, you end up with this kind of complex series of in-process trampolines. Everything's moving around. Changing control flow from the debugging engine to the module, to the target program, but it ends up being really fast when there's not signal-driven breakpoints being used. So, because we don't use ptrace, how do we catch signals? Well, like with an int3 breakpoint, we simply register the breakpoint or the callback handler with sig action. So when we do use signal-driven breakpoints like int3, we use SIG action to create a handler function in the module. It all happens on the back end. But now, what if a target program that we're debugging sets its own signal handler? And, just their own SIG trap handler for whatever reason? Well, because we're not using ptrace to catch that signal and then pass it to our own handler, we have to actually hook the signal and SIG action function internally. And if we see, a signal handler being set that tries to overwrite our signal handler, we don't allow it to happen, but we can call the original signal handler from our intermediary signal handler. So just a quick note on how we actually handle signal-driven breakpoints and things. And so this is a look at the existing type of breakpoints that we have, and I'm going to just kind of go over them. So breakpoints are registered to a handler function. I already kind of showed this. So Shiva trace register handle. We've got a function called BP handler, and we say we want to use an int3 breakpoint. So this registers the handler specifically for that type of breakpoint. We look up the address to the symbol main in our target binary, and then we set a breakpoint on that address, and it's registered to the handler. The handler, just a super, super simple handler function in the same module. So the first type of breakpoint we'll go over is called a Shiva trace BP jump. It's essentially a jump breakpoint. It's specifically useful for instrumenting branch instructions, jump instructions. So if you want to put a handler, a callback function that gets hit on every single branch instruction, this can be done. This particular breakpoint type actually still needs a little bit of work, but essentially, let's say you have a jump, and when you set this type of breakpoint, it overwrites the jump offset with an offset to the handler. The handler executes whatever code you want it to, then it rewinds the stack, resets the registers, and goes back to the original target. This can be useful for all kinds of things, and they're fast. May defeat breakpoint detection with anti-debugging too. It really depends. So another type is a call hook breakpoint. So real simple. This only actually works with the small code model, but for now. But this type of breakpoint replaces the call offset on an immediate call instruction. This can be really good for building function tracers, and I'm going to demo a little function tracer I wrote at the end. So something kind of like ltrace. So these are it replaces the call offset, calls the call handler function, and then your handler function can then call the original function that was meant to be called and return that value. So then we have trampoline breakpoint. So a trampoline breakpoint, I don't know if any of you remember that paper from like 98 by Silvio on inline function hooking in the kernel. Okay. But essentially, it's like on 64-bit, this is like a 13-byte hook where the first 13 bytes of any function, these are nice because you can hook any function, not just a shared library function, but any function, overriding the first 7 to 13 bytes with those assembly instructions. And when you call back to the original function, it internally replaces the original bytes and everything. But doing function trampolining can be a little bit dangerous because the mem copies are not in atomic operation. So in a multi-threaded scenario, it could be going to replace the original code bytes, and then another thread of execution comes down. This can be done securely. I've done it in the kernel before securely a long time ago. I just haven't had the time to sit down and come up with some ways, because this isn't actually even fully handling multi-threaded applications yet. So the trampoline hooks are nice for, hooking functions, any type of function. The next is PLT got hooks. Everybody here probably knows what a PLT got hook is, but overriding, the global offset table to redirect a function. Well, this is actually a little bit tricky in Shiva because the module that performs, that would set the PLT got breakpoint runs before the dynamic linker is even loaded. So by the time the dynamic linker runs, it tries to then go and repatch the global offset table over your patch. And so Shiva internally will actually modify the relocation tables and remove the jump slot relocation for the function that you're hooking so that the dynamic linker doesn't try to go in and repatch it. So let's see here. And you can also register a single callback handler for multiple hooks. So you could set up a hook for every single PLT got function being called, and they all register back to the same handler, or you can do individual handlers. But this becomes important when you're designing security features and things. And we'll get to that a little later with the demo I have. So the int3 breakpoint, standard int3 breakpoint, single byte opcode, delivers a sig trap, and internally it just registers a signal handler. We already went over that. Another type of breakpoint, which may be useful when you're reverse engineering a hardened binary, is using a sig-il breakpoint, which installs a 2-byte undefined opcode, which will then trigger a sig-illegal signal when it hits. So you have options. Also, a seg-v breakpoint. So just simply inserting an instruction. It's a 6-byte instruction, I think, that will trigger a seg-v, and then the handler catches that seg-v signal. So these may come in handy when you're working on really weird shit, reverse engineering, reversing really weird stuff, or trying to defeat, certain types of dynamic analysis. This stuff, may come in handy. So now as far as reading and writing to process memory, very similar to ptrace, you have a peek and you have a poke. You can get the register value, set the register value. And these are part of the Shiva Trace API. So in-process debugging tools with Shiva. So I keep kind of coming back to this. Okay, so I'm going to actually, give you my first demo here in a minute. So this part of the, inspiration for designing this also kind of started out as I'd written this function tracer, a long time ago in 2013. Really slow, uses ptrace. And I wanted to rewrite a function tracer that was an in-process function tracer. And then I kind of just started piecing my ideas together. And I'm like, why don't you just design this whole modular system? Then you can make anything you want, and then you can make a function tracer too. So that's how we got here. And so this function tracer, it's a module. It uses the call hook type breakpoint, where it sets a breakpoint on every single call instruction using this technique, and then invokes a handler function, which will print the tracing information. So it's actually pretty fast. Here's one of the times that I got, if you run test just prints, hello world. I think it was printing it like 1,000 times or something, 52 microseconds. And then if you run test using the Shiva function tracer, it was 155 microseconds. Whereas ltrace, 3.5 seconds, which is pretty slow comparatively. So that was one of the interesting things I wanted to do. Now, let me just sit this down. Okay, so as I mentioned earlier, the module is being loaded from a specific location, so I have to actually copy that into place. I guess I don't have a microphone holder, so. Yes, I can. Thank you. Okay. Is that? Bigger on the screen? All right, let's see. Sorry. So actually it's really just on this side I need. I'll widen it. So, okay, so basically first thing I'm going to do is, here actually, just a second, sorry about that. Just copy, so I'm going to copy functracer.o, which is the function tracing module, into place. And then we have this test binary, simply just prints hello world a whole bunch. Well, you got to type an argument after it. So we look at this, we time it 2 microseconds. Now if we run Shiva with it, and we put the function tracing module in place, so we'll say Shiva test ABC. So we can see that it traced all the function calls. Here, let me time it. So 48 microseconds, and I'll scroll up, it shows all the PLT calls, and now showing you this again with, let's see, ltrace it's significantly slower. So it's and then also let me just kind of show you the code for that function tracer, just to give you a little context over here on the right. So we have this call site handler function. That's the registered breakpoint handler. So every call instruction invoked this call site handler function. And then right down here, we have an init function, and that's it. I mean, it's really pretty simple. And I won't get into all the specific details of the code, but it's still a little rough around the edges. I want to be able to write like a compiler wrapper that is able to insert macros and things that the developer would otherwise have to know to insert. That kind of makes it clunky and stuff. But like, you know, basically what I'm saying is I want to get it smooth and nice and easy to use. So next, let's see here. So the next example here is a security module. So this does control flow integrity against return into PLT attacks. I think I may need you to hold my mic again for just a moment. Sorry. Thank you. So, yeah, essentially this handles forward edge and backward edge control flow integrity. It hooks every single PLT call so that it invokes a handler which checks the control flow integrity. It's all done from a pretty simple module. And let me load that into, let me get that in place. So again here, I've got to copy the module into place. It's PLT CFI.O. And then let's just quickly look at this vulnerable program. It's actually not even an exploit, just exploiting itself. It's basically setting its own return address to return into the system function and execute a shell, just for the purpose of a proof of concept here. So if we run this program, well, here, I was going to show you this one first. So you get a shell. Returns into the system function, you know, pops the address to bin sh into RDI. And if we look at the program segment of test phone, we look at the PT. Here, well, let me just do it like this. Grep interpreter. Let's see. So we can see that the dynamic linker is specified to Shiva on this test phone program. So we'll run test phone, and it says detected illegal return address in the PLT. Just a quick look at this code. Again, a module, you've got this this PLT handler function. So every time a PLT function's invoked, whether it's called or somebody returns into it, the control flow information is checked. There's a lot of really nice data structures in the Shiva context struct that give you access to things like control flow integrity and control flow information and things like that. So again, simple little module here. And next, oops, that was an accident. Next we have, so this is just another, I already actually showed you guys this one, so to save a little time, I'm going to move past this, but essentially this just hooks the system function, and then somebody tries to call system and pass a command injection, or basically sanitizes the command string to make sure that there's no pipe or semicolon symbols in there. So thank you. All right, so y'all like the shirt my wife made me? All right, thank you. So here, I might as well show it to you here. Let's see here. So right here, we've got this program, testinject.c. Very simple. You know, it takes an argument that you're supposed to pass to the ls command. This can obviously be exploited via command injection vulnerability. You know, this is actually kind of a very overly simplified example, but the idea is that, you can very easily write a module like this to, hook the function, sanitize the string, but it's done in a way, the thing about Shiva, because of the whole linking process, is I've tried to design something that will seamlessly fit into the existing ELF ABI, the existing linkers, the dynamic linkers, something that could potentially be permanently, put into practice. That you have two dynamic linkers. You've got one that loads security modules that execute before the second dynamic linker, then you chain together the second dynamic linker. And, so I see this in the future potentially becoming something that's utilized for all kinds of things, maybe other than just security. So you can use it to crack software. So, you can really use it for anything, where you're trying to modify the existing program. But I put an example in here of just a simple program that, let's see. Let's see. I may not actually have it on here right now, but that's okay. You get the idea. You got a check serial function or something. You can hook that function very easily with Shiva and modify its functionality. So Shiva for debugging hardened binaries. So I've already talked a little bit about this. A hardened binary could be binary protected binary, something that using some kind of software protection, or like on systems that are PAX hardened. If you recall, there's a lot of mprotect restrictions, different things that prevent ptrace from working to actually debug these hardened executables. So Shiva would be really valuable for being able to write reverse engineering tools and things. So I'm actually, have a little example here. So we have a program called test-anti-debug.c, and let me just show you the code real quick. So very simple code. It has a constructor that uses ptrace and prctl to try to make debugging hard. Oversimplified example, but you can see, we run ltrace on it and it fails, says you cannot debug me. Now let me put the function tracer back into place here real quick. Now if we run our function tracer on it, we see that it works because it's not trying to attach with ptrace. It's merging it into its own process address space and then working from there. Let's see. So another thing, because Shiva relies on libelfmaster under the hood, which is a ELF parsing library I wrote a long time ago, a few years ago, that does forensic reconstruction on binaries that have metadata that's been destroyed, sections that have been stripped, symbols that are removed. There's a number of techniques that I've kind of employed over the years that libelfmaster uses. So if you have a program, for instance, that's stripped, and let's just look at this real quick. Let's see here. Symbol tables and section headers look pretty messed up to me. So anyway, we run a ltrace, and even though the executable test stripped runs, it doesn't actually get a trace on it because it can't. ltrace and other debugging tools tend to rely on section headers and other high-level metadata from the ELF binary. Again, if you use Shiva, you'll get some stuff here. It's actually the target program crashing, not Shiva. But so next here, I want to just quickly, and I'm almost done here, but current limitations are it doesn't fully support multi-threaded applications. In fact, it doesn't at all yet, but I'll touch on that in a minute. It doesn't work on FCF protection, which is just the current kind of new GCC instrumentation for control flow integrity that uses bound instructions, and that took me an hour to fix. It only works on ET-DIN executables, so position-independent executables. It actually won't even work on an ET if you're trying to debug or instrument an ET exec. In the future, that'll work too. Just due to time constraints and things, I tried to get it working as best I could. And then currently it requires a large code model. So if you want to run Shiva directly, like we did with the function tracer, you can build modules with a small code model and therefore use some other features like the call hooks. if you're using Shiva as an interpreter, the program interpreter, it can't control the address space to where the target executable and things are going to be. So the modules have to be built with a large code model. Kind of a boring detail, but it's true. Future plans. So I currently haven't, it's still private, but I would ultimately, I think, like to open source it and, see where it goes. Continue, obviously, to expand on the functionality. So anything that I'm trying to build or do with Shiva naturally forces me to keep designing it and, adding all the features and bells and whistles that a reverse engineer or engineer might need. I do want to, I mentioned this, like a GCC wrapper or something that handles certain ugly things that have to be inserted into the code. It's such a weird project in terms of how it works and making it work that it can be, there's a few little clunky parts when you're programming it. Like you have to manually put in a macro to rewind the stack to return from certain types of handlers, things like that. I'd like that to all be automatically put into the module code at compile time so the developer doesn't have to think about it. Handling threads, handling multiple modules. Currently, it can only handle one module at a time. That's easy to fix down the road. And handling threads. So a note on handling threads. So I was actually talking to Parker briefly about this last night. He's like, well, how does it handle threads if you're not using ptrace? Because ptrace can get events. It can say, okay, look, a thread just spawned. Let's attach to it. So with this, how I at least kind of envision in my mind how it might work is TLS resolver hooks, pthread create hooks. So anytime pthread create's called, we have an internal hook that then says, okay, this thread's being created. Let's replace, the pthread function that it would be invoking with our own handler function. And so then, our handler gets brought into that thread. And then also using shared memory segments. It's really already shared memory at this point, but between the different threads to synchronize and communicate. And so this I don't have fully worked out, but I would like to definitely get there. I got to learn a lot about TLS this last year and a half working on a Virginia Tech Popcorn Linux thing. And it was actually really interesting. I came up with some interesting virus infection techniques too. I haven't published yet, but TLS related. So related works. K-probes, kind of similar to K-probes in terms of, the programming interface. There was a paper I published not long ago in temp.out called Preloading the Linker for Fun and Profit. It was my first experiment with building a custom dynamic linker. I'd mentioned earlier that this simply loads modular virus, but it's interesting and it kind of shows you where this began. And then embedded ELF debugging. So this is an incredible paper by Mayhem back in the early 2000s. I believe the way his project worked is that the debugging engine was a relocatable object that got injected into the target binary, but it was still an in-process debugging technology and really cool stuff. So really grateful to Mayhem, and then also the Gruck, wrote the userland exec implementation years ago, which is just a userland implementation of the sysexec system call, and that's normally in the kernel. So questions? Justin.
Can you talk just a little bit more about how you got around the new FCF?
Oh yeah. So I didn't get around them. I wasn't trying to exploit them per se. It's just that the FCF protection, the procedure linkage table stubs are different because of the BND instructions, the bound instructions, and libelfmaster didn't handle those type of PLT lookups. Yeah, it was just a matter of not having the time to quite finish the code. Yeah. Thank you. Rich.
For your call site hooks, how do you discover location of calls?
Yes. So when Shiva initially runs and loads the target executable and module, it analyzes the executable, disassembles it, and builds a bunch of control flow integrity information that you can use or not. But so it kind of has it there in convenient access for you in that context struct. Load, it's in some type of data structure, hash or a linked list. Yes. So the Shiva dynamic linker loads the module into the address space, passes control to the dynamic linker, and those shared libraries are also in the same process address space. So it's really just a linker that's loading, executable code before the dynamic linker gets a chance to do that, for other reasons. So it's all in one big, it's like one big happy family of programs communicating, within an address space. Yeah, thank you. All right. Thank you. Appreciate it. That's my daughter, the elf princess. Thanks, guys. Thanks for coming. Hey, honey. Thanks. All right, let's see. I'm going to hang out for Rich's talk.
What's that? No. Okay. I do have, if necessary, I can do it just from slides. I have one live demo, but. He's sorting out the video. Well, I do have what you'll see. It may work. I've never tried it. Okay.
We kind of
You need a laptop.
I'll give this a try. So wait, then I don't want the HDMI?
Yeah.
Oh, okay, cool. Accept. Let's show you the wrong screen. Alright. Okay, I'm good to go.
All right, we're going to start with a couple of announcements here, real quick. There are Nalgene bottles next to the containers of soup in the back. If you'd like one of either one, probably don't fill the entire container with soup. That might be a little much, considering how warm and hot it is out there. Just remember to stay hydrated, sunscreen, etc. We are asking our speakers to monitor the question channel on Discord after their talks. So if you don't get a chance to ask a question or something comes up a little later, just hit up the speaker in the question channel. We do have the 4 NFT taco delivery service that's out there, accepting shady bucks and delivering tacos to you airily. Let's see, we do have a car hacking workshop happening over near the night market later on. We do have the Lost and Found up at the reception desk. If you lose something or find something, head on up there. And, the restaurant on site is a really nice little restaurant. Excellent food, excellent drinks. They are closed to everyone but us for the duration of camp. And they have some reservations available, so if you're just tired of making food, there's a phone number up at the general store front office where you can call. Actually, there's even a phone there. It's not hooked into the Shady Tail network, I don't think, but it will get you to the restaurant if you want to make a reservation, so take advantage of that if you're so inclined. And I think that's about it. So Rich is here speaking, our next speaker, longtime friend of ours, so we really appreciate him speaking. And today he's going to be presenting on EBPF, stupid fly, attack and defense. So please welcome him to the stage.
Thank you, everybody. This is the extra better program for finagling, because eBPF lets you mess with programs. I am Richard Johnson. I do research at Trellix. We're hiring, etc. I run a company that does training on fuzzing, and because this is because I do fuzzing, of course, we need to do some live fuzzing. So, as I kick off this talk, let's also kick off some fuzzing. And I'll come back to this, and hopefully we'll have some crashes by the time I'm done talking. Okay, so what is this talk about? Well, a long time ago, as Gio mentioned, I've been coming to ToorCons since the early 2000s, and 2004, I think, was my first ToorCon presentation, and at the time I was writing kernel rootkits and gave a attack and defense talk on what you can do from the kernel when you want to inject into user processes. And so at the time, I had written basically a implementation of tripwire that was kernel resident. You had a list of whitelist hashes or allow list for what binaries can run. So you could do integrity checking. And then I had a thing that injected a virus into the userland process on the fly from the loader using a PLT infection technique from Silvio. So, and as it turns out, I'm also an author for Temp Out, so you get a double elf-focused talks here back to back. There isn't really any overlap between Ryan's talk, Elfmaster's talk, and mine, but they are somewhat related in linking and loading. So what we're going to do is we're going to talk about these concepts of how to do both a defensive technique and an offensive technique from the perspective of a kernel privilege, which these days is available to you through a new set of system calls with the eBPF infrastructure. So what exactly does that mean? Well, we're going to quickly talk about the general Linux tracing infrastructure that's available to you, the different APIs, and what's come before eBPF. Then we'll talk about how eBPF works, the APIs that are available, the libraries, and how you might write your own eBPF program. Then we're going to do a pretty quick deep dive into how processes come to be from the time you try to invocate an executable, how it travels through the kernel, gets mapped into memory, and then linked all together. And as we do that, we'll be talking about the functions that you can possibly hook using eBPF. And then I have a few different tools I've written on top of that do things like log the ELF as it loads through these different functions. So it's kind of like a function trace, hashing the ELF binaries themselves to, again, do a whitelist kind of check. And then finally, a way to inject a ROP chain or your own library path in the process of linking and loading. So you can subvert the execution of a process and inject arbitrary code. And then finally, at the end, I hopefully will be able to show you a crash in some of this infrastructure and software that's being used to run all these things, and which is somewhat of a preview for my upcoming talk at Black Hat, which talks about eBPF on Windows. So first, the Linux tracing infrastructure. Basically, we have a need to trace processes. We need to know when they're executing system calls or when they're executing various library functions in order to diagnose problems with them or, understand the behaviors of programs on your system. And so Linux initially provided things like strace. Various Unixes have provided strace, which is a system call tracer. And then if you amp that up a little bit, you end up with a program called dtrace, which came from Solaris and was a method for hooking functions and interrogating parameters, and it was type aware and things like that. And then we have a kernel module called systemtap, which kind of expands upon that and uses uprobes and kprobes, which are basically breakpoint-based hooks that the kernel can inject natively. And then now ftrace is part of the Linux kernel, which exposes all this through a proc-like system. It's in syskernel ftrace, but you can interact with the file system layer to turn on and off tracing and hooks and things like that. And then there's LTTNG, which is the Linux tracing technology's next generation, which is just yet more of all the kitchen sink. And finally, the eBPF is here to wipe the table clean and replace all of that as the forward-looking technology. And the whole point of eBPF in general is to provide telemetry for EDR, XDR systems, be able to do post-intrusion analysis and forensics, things like that. Also, it can be used to intercept network traffic before it even gets to your kernel, so you can do load balancing or rootkit type things without the operating system ever even seeing those packets come off the wire. You can literally rewrite the packet headers and say, oh, I received this packet and the destination was my IP, but I'm going to change that destination IP, send it right back to the NIC, and it will send it right back out, and the OS never sees it. So that's being used in production in cloud environments. Kubernetes is starting to adopt it, things like that. So it's actually been in the kernel for almost 10 years or so, but it's only in the last couple of years has it really been productized and used quite a bit. And also one other thing is in the news more recently, in the past few months, we've seen these headlines that say, we're seeing new malware out of somewhere in Asia and, using the most sophisticated backdoors and rootkits ever seen and all this. That's using the old BPF filter infrastructure. So like if you've ever used TCP dump and you say, I want to filter on port 80 to see my web traffic, that is a BPF filter. And that's a bytecode language that gets compiled and put into the kernel so that you can filter on those packets. eBPF is an extension of that system so that you can do API hooks as well as network traffic introspection. So in order to do program modification and not just network packets like the traditional BPF, they had to add in an interoperation layer between eBPF and all those tracing subsystems. And all those subsystems, again, are basically boiled down to using three different types of hooks. There's a uprobe, a kprobe, and trace points. trace points is the simplest. It's code annotations. If you're writing software, you have a macro that you put there and you say, you can hook at this function. And so it's compile time available. The kernel knows how to find it. And you can use those symbol names as places to hook. So all of your system calls, for example, have trace points in them so that you can use the supported infrastructure for tracing syscalls instead of doing what we used to do, which is, of course, patch the system call table and divert it using trampolines and whatnot. So besides that, as I said, there's the uprobe and kprobes, which are just breakpoint based. int3 is breakpoint. And so they simply replace that byte of code. A breakpoint generates an exception. Exceptions bubble up through your CPU to the kernel. The kernel says, yep, I'm waiting for this breakpoint. I'm aware of it. This is mine. And then from there, you can do whatever you want. You have callback functions. Now for collecting so that's the hooking infrastructure. Once you have hooks in place, you want to be able to communicate out to user processes or a daemon that's doing the logging, things like that. And so there's various ways to communicate between these hooking engines. There's perf events, which is the way that your system does things like performance counters, how many missed branches happened in the last n seconds or things like that, just statistical event-based things. Then there's the ftrace, as I said. You can cat a file and enable and echo to a file that enables a certain hook, and then cat a file that dumps the log for that. And then these other extensions. With eBPF, there's actually, in addition to the system call that allows you to place the hooks, there is also a set of data structures that are made available to you. And so the eBPF programs themselves, they're a bytecode that gets compiled with LLVM, and then that bytecode gets JITted at runtime into the kernel itself. And this is all done through system calls. Well, in addition to those, there are linked lists and hash tables, and there's like 6 or 7 different type of data structures available so that the kernel hooks can talk to, put something in memory that is then mapped into user land as well when you use the correct system call. So this is a communication pathway between kernel and user. And then to interact with these, you use these front-end tools. So probably most people have used strace at some time in their life to figure out why a program is crashing or not running properly. You can also, as I said, use perftrace to get a list of the system calls. That's just another kernel-supported way. ftrace, again, file system hooks. dtrace has like a one-liner command line tool and so on. We're going to look specifically at the tools for eBPF. So this is not very large text, so you might not be able to see it too well, but this is an example. If you go list what's in the syskernel tracing, these are all those files on disk that you can interact with to turn on or off hooks and observe various things built into your kernel. But it becomes a little bit cumbersome to do file I/O to enable tons of hooks or to dynamically do things, and so it's not ideal. It's nice for if you just need to hook a couple of things manually. But all those things tied together, what we can get out of that is what you want from a tracing infrastructure is the ability to instrument function entry points, function returns, so you can get the return values. You want to be able to ideally hook arbitrary locations, not just function entry points, but let's say a call site, for example. You want to be able to access the register context, so you don't only want coverage logging, but you want to be able to collect the state and look at the pointers, the arguments that are being passed to these functions. And in order to enable us to do any sort of offensive or defensive techniques, we want to be able to write to arbitrary memory. In the case of eBPF, it doesn't let you write to arbitrary kernel memory, but it does let you write to arbitrary userland memory, which we will leverage in our techniques. And ideally, of course, if it's going to be kernel provided, it should allow us to do hooking on the kernel as well as userland. And so eBPF basically provides all of this for us. So as I said, it's based upon the original BPF bytecode language, and that's why this is another bytecode that gets interpreted. It's a very simple RISC-like language. It has something like 26 instructions or something. And it runs inside of a virtual machine. So it has its own interpreter virtual machine, and then that virtual machine, as it runs, jits it into native code. In order to interact with BPF, again, there's a system call, it's just sysbpf, and there's a big list of commands that you can pass it. I won't bother reading the command page, you can look it up yourself, but these are all different types of filters and programs and various things that you can do with eBPF on the right. So there's only one system call, but it has a whole lot of functionality behind it. It's kind of like an ioctl interface. And so if you want to use BPF, you have a few options. You can sit down and write you can write assembler if you want. You can write BPF bytecode directly. Or you can write in a C-like language and use LLVM to compile it. Or you can even use BPF trace, which is modeled after dtrace. So it takes kind of one-liner expressions saying, place a hook here, and every time this is called, dump the arguments and things like that. You can write plugins in Python or Go. And in fact, I'm not much of a Go programmer, but in my opinion, the Go infrastructure for this is the easiest to use. It's what my code is written in. And they're also working on, everything's migrating towards this thing called libbpf, which is a newer API. It has some higher level abstractions in it. You can reference data structures and the kernel directly, and it knows all the type information. And they're working towards this concept of compile once, run everywhere, for portability on the kernel side. Because traditionally, if you compile a kernel module, it's tied to the version of the kernel that you're running, right? And kernel changes. And so the idea for that is that if you write what would normally be in a kernel module, you can write most of that in BPF, and that becomes now portable even across operating systems, as Microsoft is implementing eBPF as well. So what that really means is if you write a load balancer in eBPF, you can run it on both Windows and Linux, and at least most of that will be portable. But you could also run it on different architectures of Linux. You could have an ARM Linux and an x86 Linux, and that same module would be loadable on both. So here's an example, again, this is kind of a small screen, but of what a one-liner might look like if we wanted to trace the open call. So sysopen and the entry point, and then this would just list all the files that the system opens. And the syntax is very similar to dtrace, which if you've done much tracing before, you've probably encountered. But it's designed to let you just be very agile and quickly interrogate various things using one-liners. And this is, they don't have to be one-liners. They can also be scripts. On the right-hand side, it shows just a couple of different BPF trace formatted scripts for capturing both open and open at. So you get both system calls. For the Go BPF, there are basically a couple of different APIs that you need to call. In this case, if we wanted to hook the execve system call, we just use this BPF get system call function name and then attach kprobe down here at the bottom. So very, very simple, just a couple of APIs, and then you implement the callback, in this case, kprobe down here. And the body of that callback, here's the module itself. So this is BPF syntax. It's very C-like, or it is C really. It has limitations because it's running in a VM, so it's sandboxed. But you write about 8-10 lines of Go code, and then you write your functions that implement the callbacks, and you're off and working. And this is my implementation of the execve system call, where I am grabbing the group ID, task ID, things like that, putting it into a context so I can track it. When other system calls get called, I can tie that context together. That was a kprobe, and for uprobes, it's just as easy. In this case, I'm saying I want to attach a user probe on libdl.so. So when you dynamically load libraries, I want to intercept that. And in particular, the function that I want to hook is _dl_allocate TLS init, which is called whenever the linker is loaded. So if you want to intercept the linker, the earliest point that eBPF can do it is at this symbol from my experimentation. And the nice thing about hooking the linker that early is that GDB can't attach to it. So if you are writing some sort of attack payload, you're able to subvert the process before it's debuggable. And from there, you should be able to hook enough to be undetectable. So let's talk a little bit more about that whole linking and loading process. Excuse me. Okay, so our goals again are going to be to either verify a process, and if it doesn't match a hash, we want to kill it and terminate it because it is considered invalid and malicious. Or we want to subvert the loading of a process, and we want to be able to use basically that hook I just showed to inject a library or replace the loading of libc, and we can chain it and effectively implement our own LD preload without having to use the environment variable. And also at that point in time, we can, of course, change the register state in the user process and write to memory, and so we can inject a ROP payload and do arbitrary things. So in order to do that, we need to understand the flow of how programs get loaded and which, how do we discover these locations that we want to hook and determine which is the appropriate place to do so. So the Linux linking and loading process, of course, is shared between the kernel, sets up your memory maps and creates a process space that's virtualized for that individual process. And then the linker does the job of, if it's a dynamic library or dynamic program, to load in the shared libraries. In the Linux loader, it's going to read the ELF header and the segments and figure out what memory mapping this program is requiring. It'll do relocations because it's going to, of course, have randomized address layouts, and so it needs to update the process with where it's been moved. And then the entry point is typically set to libc start main, which is a little stub that's going to call, it's in your linker. And that maps whatever dynamic dependencies you may have, performs relocations on the symbols, populates the function tables, and then eventually goes to the actual main that you've declared. And in that, if there's constructors or initializer functions, which, by the way, if you're playing the CTF, here's a hint. Thanks for coming to my talk. One of the things involved is that you need to look at that libc start main call very closely. Okay, moving on. So the system call that gets executed behind sys exec ve is do exec ve. So the system call calls, this is the main body of the program, or the main function that's called to start loading your process, sorry. Then the function chain in order is libc, you call exec ve, then you call the system call sys exec ve, which calls into do exec ve, and so on and so forth. And while it's doing this, one of the things it's reading your ELF header and it's figuring out what the binary format for this is, what the loader is. If it's an ELF file, it does one thing. If you've got a shebang, bang, bin, bash, it does another thing. This is all part of the execution flow. And once you get to the Linux BPRM, which is the binary program structure, it's then starts to create and populate the memory map. And the reason that we need to know all this is we need to wait until the process is live enough to start modifying it. So we need to let the kernel get somewhere deep into the linking and loading process, but we want to hook it before, of course, it actually gives control to the process itself. So if you go in here and you read all this code, you'll find that Linux BPRM function is where the memory map is going to be created. It's also where you can discover what the location of the stack is. And it also will have the strings that will point to which binary is currently being loaded and what the interpreter for that binary might be, all these various things. And then there'll be a buffer with the header because it's processing the header to determine how to load it. And then it sets the user ID and privileges, which credentials opens your standard in, standard out, standard error. And then it talks to the scheduler. It says, hey, do you have a free CPU? I would like to run this program now. I've got it into memory and I need to know what core to assign it to. And then finally, it's created this data structure that the kernel is going to use. And it says, okay, go ahead and execute this binary program. And at that point, the memory map has been made, the stack has been set, and the code has been loaded into memory. Now it's needing to find the linker. And so it searches for the binary handler for an ELF and calls load binary. Sorry, that's when the mapping gets done. And then it loads the interpreter as part of that load ELF binary process. So at this point in time, you can start to patch things from the kernel side if necessary. The validates the magic, yes. Okay, so then it's determining. So we're still looking for where we're going to do our hash, right? So the program needs to be complete enough that we can be sure that we have code that we can hash. And we're in this limited execution environment. BPF programs can only have 4096 instructions, assembly instructions per program. They call each function its own program. So you can have one function that has up to 4096 BPF instructions long, and you need to implement a hashing function doing so. And you only have like 12 bytes of stack space by default. There's all these limitations. And so that's why we're like being careful about where to look to do the hashing. There's the ELF map. That's what I was waiting for. Okay. And don't need to read all this out loud to you. Okay, so once you go through this process of loading the binary, getting it mapped in, here's the output of my tracer, right? And so I'm showing that it's executing a process. Here's your user ID, the process ID. In this case, I just ran the who or W program. It followed it through the do open exec at function call, then the load elf binary. It was able to hash the BPRM structure itself. And then it knows that it wants to track that particular binary load. We can see that it then also calls open exec at again on the linker, because that's actually going to be the first binary that gets mapped into the program for dynamic binaries. Then it maps the various executable or loadable segments from the binary, and also the virtual device driver, VDSO, which itself is just a page of code that the kernel maps into every user process. I actually investigated trying to patch that so you would be able to hook all processes instantaneously. And unfortunately, you can't write that. It's weird. It's statically compiled into the kernel itself. So you can't like change the pointers to where the VDSO is. It's hard-coded. Anyways, so then it creates the all tables, loads the interpreter, finds the entry point, starts the thread, and then now it is at the end here running in the user process. So the hook code is what I showed earlier. Then we hook starting the thread. So as soon as the thread is created, now is ready to actually do the task switch and go into executing in the linker itself. And that's where we want to do our hash. So I'm using murmur hash 2 because of the constraints for the virtual machine eBPF. Minor detail, you could do things like send some of the byte stream out to a userland daemon if you wanted to do more integrity checking and kind of pause the loading of that process, but this was just an easy way to do it inline. So I have a hook on load elf binary, and you can see that I only have 256 bytes of a buffer to probe read into, but here I'm reading from the userland memory that had just been allocated into the buffer, and then I'm performing a hash upon it. Now, here, let's see. Okay, so yeah, so if we wanted to send the hash values to userland, again, they have these ELF maps and the BPF maps rather. And so here, it's one of the APIs that you can call is BPF initialize perf map. That allows you to send effectively packets from the kernel to userland through the perf subsystem. Or you can just write to the data structures and then have a separate process that reads from those data structures and pulls them. And so, as I said, we can read from basically arbitrary kernel memory, but we cannot write to pages in kernel. So we can't write kernel memory. We can write to userland. And so we're going to implement that linker hook that will be linked into all dynamic processes. So instead of hooking VDSO, which was my original approach, instead we can just hook all the linkers and then determine which process we're in and do whatever we want from there. And in our case, what we're going to do is hook that very early function. And if we did not pass the validation of the hashing, then we'll force termination. So let me see here. I think that's what this demo is. Yeah, so here's the hook in the linker, the DL allocate TLS init. That's in your ld.so. And what it's doing is it's reading from the user. You can see I have my squirt EDR there, and it's performing the hash, reading bytes from the process, determining if the hash maps or it matches what the stored hash was, and then it will in this case, if the hash does not match, then it will write hello toorcon basically to the stack, and so that way when the function that we've just hooked returns, then it will call into, well, garbage in this case, just force terminate. You could have it do whatever you want. This is just showing that we have execution control and causing it to crash, right? It's just a simple way to do that. Now, from that basic same concept, we can control call stack. Okay, so yeah, that's what I'm showing here, is basically I've checked the hash, it didn't match. I've now injected into the call stack some text, which just looks like bytes there. But if we look at RSP as a string, it says hello toorcon there. So that's how you would enforce ACLs or do verification, force terminate programs. Of course, if we're writing to the stack, that's also where we can put a ROP chain and do arbitrary code execution from there, knowing that we have the linker and that we can, in my very first hook, I showed libdl. So on later library loads as well, you can effectively inject into any one of those processes anytime a library is loaded. So in this case, I had a demo where whenever sudo is called, we subvert the dlopen call, and instead of loading libc first, this was loading temp tc.so, toorcamp.so. So I'm replacing the library load and then chaining libc after that. And unfortunately, my ANSI art didn't come out too clearly here. This is from my ToorCon talk last September. But when it ran sudo who am I, it dumped out hello toorcon. So hopefully, I know that was kind of quick going over that, but basically what we have is a number of locations that I've identified via tracing the ELF linking and loading. The first symbol that you can hook using eBPF infrastructure to get into all processes, the ability to do hashing and determine that this is indeed, has not been a patched binary, force terminate just by writing to the stack. Using that same technique, you can write to the stack and inject a ROP chain, or you can change the libraries that are getting loaded by the dynamic linker. So those are the three different things I've implemented, and I have a link at the end here with the implementation. That's on GitHub, so you can check out that code after the talk. So where is eBPF going? Well, it's been in the Linux kernel for about a decade now, and it's been adopted the last few years and productized. Last May, Microsoft announced that they were going to be implementing eBPF. And this May, they officially did their first release. And I'm actually, as I mentioned, going to be talking more about that at Black Hat. However, I had already fuzzed some of the code that Microsoft ended up adopting because, of course, the Linux kernel implementation of eBPF is GPL licensed. So, of course, Microsoft can't use that. But eBPF being a general bytecode and interpretable language as well as a JIT engine, it can be used in many different contexts. So, for example, right now, anywhere that Lua is used or Lua JIT, eBPF can be used instead. There's a userland implementation of the eBPF virtual machine called uBPF. And it's what I've been fuzzing in the background here, and you're going to see that I found some vulnerabilities in it. Well, it turns out that Microsoft just happened to have adopted uBPF as their interpreter engine. It's BSD licensed. You can put it in the kernel. And so, in fact, that's what they did. There's also a static verifier component. The Linux kernel has a pretty lightweight static verifier built in for these eBPF programs. It loads the bytecode, it does the verification, and then it does the JIT and execution. Well, some academics came along, they wrote this verifier called the Prevail static verifier for eBPF bytecode. So, of course, I fuzzed that too. And we'll see how that turned out in just a moment. But we're going to see eBPF make its way to all the main operating systems eventually. It is the unifying technology for doing telemetry these days. It's basically what they have been wanting to build for quite some time to prevent people from having to have signed drivers or to be able to run code in kernel context that's trusted and sandboxed. So you don't have to do an update on a driver, you don't have to go through the Windows licensing process again and things like that. In fact, when Ryan Elfmaster was doing his linker research, we talked about it a little bit, and he shared his prototype, I think from temp out, and I implemented a little thing that loads the uBPF VM into the linker so you can write those extension modules in eBPF language itself with all the security guarantees, meaning that if you're writing your rootkit, you're writing it in a sandbox environment that's guaranteed not to crash the processes and do things like that as well. So it's kind of nice. But yeah, so uBPF, it's BSD licensed. It's, again, fast, similar to Lua JIT. It includes both the VM interpreter as well as the JIT engine. And let's see how we did. It turns out that in May, when Microsoft announced that they had shipped their first version of their eBPF, I, of course, started to submit the bugs that I had found. And they have hardened it. So I checked out the version from last fall that I had originally done this research on so that we can find these bugs pretty quickly now. But they have since patched a number of bugs in both of these softwares. Okay, so 34 minutes ago when I got on stage, you saw me kick off this fuzzing run. And what this fuzzing run is, it is the uBPF VM. I gave it a arbitrary, I think, user bin ID as input. Now, what a eBPF program normally looks like is when you compile it with LLVM, it has an eBPF target. It outputs an ELF object file that has a couple of special ELF sections in it. And so it knows how to open an ELF file and parse it for section tables and things like that. So this is effectively fuzzing the ELF parsing portion of eBPF. And there's a really stupid but fully exploitable bug in there that did make its way to Microsoft. So this is 0-day in the Microsoft implementation as well. Just fuzz the ELF headers and you'll find it within a half an hour like I did. But yeah, so it was able to find what it thinks is a bunch of unique crashes, but really just a couple. Oh, that would... Thanks for letting me know. Yeah, there we are. So so this is the fuzzing job while I was talking away here. It did find a bunch of crashes, and here I'll show you. The command that I ran was just as simple. If you're not familiar with fuzzing or what this is here, this is American Fuzzy Lot ++. It's one of two off-the-shelf fuzzers that I would recommend people using, either the compiler supplied libfuzzer from Clang, or AFL has all the academic advancements and whatnot. I'm using it in its default simplest mode, where you just provide it a directory that has some input files and a directory to do work in, and running test, which is just the UBPF VM, like Hello World style. But it does indeed load the fuzz elf files and tries to run them as eBPF programs. And we should have a bunch of crashes sitting here. And I'll go ahead and it looks like we got our crash here, SigSegV on writing to some destination here. Should probably... Oh, well, that's cute. Sorry, context switching to GDB. Okay, so in this case, it turns out to be a null pointer. It's adding RBP, RDI, and trying to write to it, but it appears that RBP has been nulled out. And RDI is set to -1. So we're either writing, trying to write actually off the end of memory. So in any case, it's crappy. This bug's crappy. I did submit one that is fully remotely exploitable in the verifier, but I couldn't get the verifier compiled in time while Ryan was talking. So that is the demo for today. But there are still bugs to be found there. And I don't know what other software has really adopted UBPF yet. It has been available for a couple of years, but you may find yourself dealing with eBPF randomly in some userland context or on a game server or something like that in the future. And just remember that these bugs are sitting there. All right. So get back. Okay, so the VM executes both in JIT and in interpreted mode, and found crashes in both. The Prevail static verifier, as I said, Microsoft adopted this component as well. On the right-hand side is a diagram that kind of shows what the architecture of the Windows implementation looks like. They actually use a PPL-protected Windows service, a lightweight trusted service that basically is part of your TCB. It's effectively has kernel privileges. So that's where eBPF and Prevail, or UBPF and Prevail, reside in the Windows infrastructure. But they also copied the JIT engine into the kernel, because you communicate via ioctals directly with the kernel driver, or you can communicate over RPC with this system service. And so that's how the Windows portion works. And currently, as a preview, I've got about 5 different kernel vulnerabilities, 1 arbitrary pool memory layout vulnerability, and a full remote code execution vulnerability that I'll be showing and talking more about in Vegas. But independently, you can fuzz the verifier itself and find your own crashes as well. And then while I was diagnosing one of these crashes, somehow I got Dr. Memory to crash with a corrupted program counter. And then also turns out that if you use the Python version of the eBPF API, it's easy to bypass because they use a JIT page that's writable. Oops. And so long story short, if you have privileges to write to other processes, which you would need to load an eBPF program in the first place. Then you can disable like VMware Carbon Black just by writing to the JIT page via proc. And then this is one of those Heisenbugs, but I did find a Linux kernel eBPF crash in the process of writing my tooling that I haven't been able to replicate, but you can look at the call stack later. All right, so yeah, that'll be my time. The tools are up on GitHub. I believe they're still there. I'll make sure that they are there. Please play my CTF. I wrote the CTF. It's a little mini BBS. And thanks for your time. And if there's any questions, happy to answer. Parker?
Yeah, for the Linux BPF JIT and the eBPF JIT, how many like target architectures do they support?
Oh, they just refactored the uBPF JIT so that it supports like 3 or 4 different backends right now. I forget exactly which ones offhand, but they just put that in there. And then on Linux, I actually don't know on the kernel side, but.
Have you tried other target architectures?
No. No, I haven't. That's a good idea, though. Yeah. Yeah. Thanks. Any other questions? Yeah.
So you mentioned the other OSs and stuff. What about like iOS or Android?
Yeah, so I mean, I'm predicting that. I don't know when Apple will adopt this infrastructure, but it seems to be inevitable, and it'll unify telemetry sources, and if Windows has adopted it, I just presume that it will keep propagating. Yeah, and because it is a JIT, as Parker just mentioned, it's really easy to support additional architectures because there's only like 20 some instructions. So yeah, I expect to see eBPF showing up more and more in many places. Yes.
The same process that you load eBPF like bytecode, can you also package like other bytecodes that you loaded?
Oh yeah, so there is actually, thanks for making me remember a thing. 2 things here. So yes, you can list other eBPF programs that are loaded using the system call, although it's difficult to really interrogate them or do much with them. One interesting thing, though, is on the latest versions of Ubuntu, systemd init loads to eBPF programs. And in fact, there is another hook that I guess I didn't still have in these slides. But if you hook libc clock time, I think there's a double underscore in there, you will get a hook into systemd init, and you can migrate and basically inject your eBPF program into systemd init. And so from there, systemd init will have 3 different programs. You don't know which one might be malicious, and if they try to take down any of them, you might take down the whole system. So yeah, that's another little fun one. Migrate to systemd init if you're going to actually be using this for red teaming or something. Anybody else? Cool. Thanks a lot.
And just as a reminder, there we go. Sorry. Just as a reminder, we're asking that all the speakers make themselves available in the Discord channel for talk discussion. So if you come up with a question later that you didn't think about, Rich should be able to answer you in a reasonable amount of time. 30 minutes or it's free.
All my advice is free. I don't know how valuable it is.
Oh, and I will make the reminder that if you are at all feeling ill or test positive, please mask up and contact a staff member immediately. We had one person arrive that tested positive that was dealt with immediately and in a very strenuous manner, in terms of everything was disinfected that they came in contact with, and anyone that they came in contact with is being closely monitored. So we're taking this very serious. We hope that you will too, so just please let us know. And we'll be more than happy to give you a ticket to next time. But please just be aware of that and aware of others around you. Thanks. And free bottles and soup over in the corner over there if you haven't heard yet.
Do you have a USB-C to HDMI or USB to HDMI? If not, I can turn my.
Yeah, they're obviously trying to figure stuff out.
All right, I'll give this.
So, Dylan, huh?
Yeah.
Dylan, huh?
Yeah, I pound keys way too hard.
We'll get started.
Yeah. I figured that I would just like get ready.
We do have
Okay.
but we will. I think the issue is they're trying to stream
Okay. Do I need to, if there's something I can do to make it easier for y'all, let me know.
No. It's more right there.
You're going to take the HDMI out of this, right? You're going to take the HDMI out of
In a
this.
few minutes, I'll just make some.
Yeah.
Totally.
No, I was actually just going to take the
How you
HDMI
feel for timing of your sockets?
Should be good. I've run it a couple times. Ran around 40 minutes one of them times, but I have added a couple of additional things, so I should hit about 50, maybe a little bit under.
That's fine. Yeah, it's just sometimes people are like, well, I really only have 35 minutes.
Yeah, I don't think that's gonna be a problem.
Good.
One of my things is like, I gotta make sure I don't talk too fast. But other than that,
And if you need to go a little long,
yeah,
it's fine.
okay, cool.
And you heard the announcement about the Discord?
Yes.
Talked
Yep, I'm on the Discord. I actually, while I was in the audience, just added my little Discord avatar to the so people know.
Cool. Okay. I guess we'll give them a few more minutes and then they'll have their act together. We just move forward.
check if I am out.
I don't. I think there have to be people that actually sit there as you have. Not have next.
Down the wrong tube.
Oh, Namek is an audio thing.
Oh no.
I'm sorry. I was not finding this way. I'm trying to look at this.
I managed to make it halfway through. I will understand this. 30 minutes. Okay, next presenter is you.
Yes.
Do you happen to have an HD, USB? What type of video out?
I have USB and I have
USB-C, and I don't have HDMI.
So USB-C, he only has USB-C out. So we might have to just put this up. To do it. In which case we need the camera. And then you do not have HDMI out.
I don't have HDMI out. Sorry. It's a Windows. Yeah.
Thank God. I'm sorry. Okay. So that's nice because we have the ability to use USB-C.
Okay. Cool.
Oh, wait a minute. Hold on a second. We're trying to play with getting capture stuff. We're running RGB to not RGB, GA to.
Okay.
We should just be able to give you this guy.
Okay.
We should be able to just load in the that if that's got Ethernet, we plug it in.
Well, I should just be able to open the camera app. So you're seeing, okay, so this works. I'm now OBS from this laptop to this capture. So let's go for from here to this. They get a little bit into the I couldn't hear you. So, OBS. That's a program.
Yes, OBS is a program, but, or you can just load NDI toolkit from.
I can go through this. Very obvious. OBS. I know there's a problem.
Yeah, it's probably not installed.
There's OBS.
Okay.
I guess so. Let's go for, so I'm just trying to get the camera full screen out on this. That's all I'm trying to do. And the camera app.
So do you have? Is this connected? It's up on the screen right now.
Right, because it's outputting from this.
Now we just have to get that HDMI.
Yeah, we got it.
So let's get
Right. This should just show up like a webcam, right?
exactly.
So I just show it full screen and we're good. Like double. But this should just be plug and play, right?
Should be.
Do you have another capture?
I do. We're gonna try swapping them around.
Okay. Because the camera app is not like this. Oh, we can plug it in.
Let's go ahead. Let's just try swapping these here. Let's get started.
You ready?
Yeah.
Good. We're just gonna give him the USB-C. Yep. That's the one that you were.
Let's try this.
All right, we're just about to start in here. We'll do some announcements while we're getting. Oh, the laptop is still not connected. While we're getting that set up, lost and found at Reg's desk. That includes kids. We have a large bin for them. So if you lose one or find one, take them up to registration. Let's see. We have the bottles and the soup to go in the bottles sitting over in the corner there. The restaurant, the Doe Bay restaurant here, which is quite good, really good food, really good drinks. We own the thing for the entire duration of camp. I hear they still have some reservations left. So if you're tired of cooking, it's a great place it's one of the nicer places on the island, in fact, to eat. So stop by there. After the talk, the speaker will be taking questions. But if you have a question you come up with later or you just don't want to ask out loud, you can ask in a public room on Discord. And the speaker should be visiting that with some degree of frequency. So if there's a talk that you come up with a question about later, please hit the Discord. And the 4 NFT taco delivery drone is out there. You can either call or fax in your order, and they're accepting shady bucks for that. And it is getting hot out there. Just remember to hydrate. Soup does not count towards hydration. And just put on the sunscreen, and you should be covered. And you ready? Okay, wonderful. So next up, we've got Dylan here to present, Dylan Katz, to talk about an introduction to template injection. So please give him a warm welcome.
Hi, folks. All right, lovely day out today. Let's get started. So yeah, this talk is mostly just going to be like, there's two components to it, really. The first is just giving you an idea of what template injection is and like where it shows up and kind of why it happens. And then the second is going to be like, how do we exploit it, which is the fun part. So yeah, here we go. So before we get into that, though, I want to talk about what a template is. And you can think of it like kind of like a format string. it's something that looks like this. You see these 4 little text boxes here. Each of these is an example of what a template might look like. There's a number of different languages for templating that have different styles of tags. So yeah, it's very similar to just like a standard format string, although sometimes it will have additional magic like logic and loops and all sorts of fun stuff. Yeah. So these templates are then taken into templating engines. And these will output to HTML. They'll output to, email format. Depends on what you want to use it for. Developers use templates for basically anything where you have a logic and data that you want to maybe have a little bit separate, but you still want to combine them into a single string at the end of the day. So let's take this template here. We add some data into it. This is our template engine, and we get our little output. It's not super complicated. This is a pretty basic example. One of the nice things about these, though, is that you can escape the data here. Like, let's say you're outputting HTML, you can perform HTML encoding in the template engine. And so you have this really nice separation. So you don't have to like worry as much about some of that stuff. So yeah, that's kind of a naive example. Let's show a little bit more complicated example of why this might be useful. Here is like what your bad code would look like. This is really, really basic. Like, let's just take Python and build HTML with it, which obviously this is not the best strategy for doing that for a number of reasons. Anybody know what's wrong with that? Can we see anybody in the back? Yeah, it's exactly. It's cross-site scripting. It's very like this is a textbook cross-site scripting. So this is what it would look like if you use templates for it. In this case, I'm using Jinja 2. There's a couple of pieces here. First off, you have your code looks a lot cleaner. It doesn't have like all the messy quotes all over the place, and you're not doing string appends. And again, you have the cross-site scripting separation. So the Jinja 2 page is not going to be as vulnerable to cross-site scripting because of the fact that it's performing encoding before it takes the user input and puts it into the HTML. So not too crazy. One of the things to call out here is you'll notice in that end list, there's a loop. There's the for old post and post.author.posts. That is something that's supported as part of Jinja, and a lot of languages have a lot of these templating languages have some form of for each loops or logical conditions like if statements, which obviously is going to lead to some interesting stuff. So yeah, any big questions at this point? Is everybody tracking where we're going here? No? Okay, great. Excellent. So let's talk about where things break down. Now we get into the fun part of like the mistakes that people make with this system. So this is like the textbook version of template injection. To start out with, this is how you're supposed to use these systems. So you'll note you have your template, again, separate from the user input, nicely separated here. You have a dictionary of the keys and the values, and you can see the output there is, of course, just a single string. And this is like the ideal way to do it. This is how the developers expect you to use it, and this is how real people use it. This is the mistake, which is modifying this template to include user input. And this is obviously like you can tell that this is not a good idea by looking at it because of the fact that you're appending user input with your template directly. This is kind of an easy way, like this is an easy example. But when we get into like the more, you can see in this situation, our template engine supports logic. So we're able to just multiply 7 and 7 and get 49 as the output. A lot of these systems will just support logic like multiplication in your template tags for some reason. There's a couple of different libraries that support that. So Yeah, so, but this is kind of, again, this is a textbook example. You can really see an obvious issue with the template string, but it's not the most realistic example. Also, if any of you have been around for a little bit in the space, maybe watched some content from the previous talk, you might be familiar with this type of vulnerability. It looks kind of similar to an existing binary bug, which it's literally just the same thing as a string format vulnerability. These template strings have a little bit more fanciness to them, but they're pretty much just the same type of issue as you get, right? In this situation, the issue is that you're just putting user input directly into your format string, and it's the same if you do that in C++ or if you do that in log4j. It's going to lead to a lot of problems because these format strings just have some intrinsic issues with them. They have a lot of complexity to them and are usually not where you want to be, giving your users control or your attackers control in this case. So let's talk about a little bit more of a realistic example of this, though, because, again, the previous example, super obvious. People are not going to make that mistake super easily. This is a more realistic example of kind of how templating systems can break down. Can anybody see what the problem with this code is? No? Okay, I'll tell you. The issue is, let's step through it. So, first off, let's say we do this. We set our first name and our last name to this value, right? The first template is rendered, and it becomes this. It becomes this output. Anybody see the problem yet? Yes, exactly. So we've rendered the template, and then we're going to put it into our next template and render it again. So the actual template we're evaluating now becomes this string with all of the brackets and everything, and we'll output our double 49s again. So this is a much better example of like how this type of thing will usually present in the wild. And you can see it's pretty understandable that developers might make this mistake with one of these systems. So yeah, these are great. If you're looking at code review, obviously the general dogma is just you don't want user input to go into templates. This is bad, and I'll tell you why it's bad later. That's kind of the end of the talk when we get into the more in-depth, interesting behaviors. But it's a little bit more difficult to find these vulnerabilities as an attacker without any visibility into the code or from a black box perspective. So there's a couple of different ways to do this. And I am going to tell you a little bit more about that in a second. First, I need to explain how these systems parse templates. So I'm just going to talk about that for a second. So basically what's happening is you have your template engine, and it's taking a template and user data. And first it parses the template. And to parse the template, it looks for tag delimiters, which is like these things for XML or some of these. So it looks for the start and end of each tag and pulls out all of the different tags from that value or from that template. And then it will take each tag that it finds and replace that tag with text, or in some cases, it will replace it with a variable, or it will replace it with a function call, or in the prior examples, it will evaluate the content of it, which is not great. So, okay, hold on. All right, yeah. I talked about this a little bit. Also, this picture is irrelevant to this talk. I just thought it was funny that the dog had this gigantic piece of wood in its mouth, and I don't know where it came from. So yeah, where are we getting this content from? There's a couple of different places that these parsers will get content from. And sometimes some of them are more dangerous than others. The least dangerous, except for JavaScript, where it's kind of mid-level dangerous because JavaScript, is a key value dictionary. This is just basic lookup table. You have a string, you have a value. I'll get into why this is more dangerous for JavaScript in just a moment here. But this is usually pretty safe. compared to the other methods. The next is including another section or a template. And this can take a couple of different forms. So you can either include a template from a file or a remote source. So if you are familiar with XXE, which is the XML vulnerability, that's kind of an example of where this type of thing might become problematic, where if you can load template content from external sources, you can potentially include local files or grab things from external URLs and perform SSRF. There's just a number of different challenges that tend to arise with getting data from that source. The third option, which is the most dangerous, is evaluating expressions. And this can take a couple of different forms. The example I gave earlier, obviously, is just the mathematics, but some of these templates support like just running code, or including, some of them even have pseudo languages that are written specifically for that engine, which is very interesting and strange. So yeah, I think that hopefully that gives you a pretty good idea of how parsing is supposed to work here. And this is kind of an example of what that will actually look like using the dictionary lookup. So let's say we have our context dictionary here. Very, very simple. We just pass a key and JavaScript will look up the context value by key, and that will be the new value. So yes. So now let's get into it. This is kind of the meat and potatoes of like how, now that we understand this, how we're going to use this, and how we're going to find these vulnerabilities from a blind perspective. Well, not entirely blind, but from a black box perspective. So this is the easy one. Just like throw this literally everywhere. And if you see 49, you know that you have template injection. You can change the numbers around if you want to have something more interesting, right? You can do 7 times 20 or whatever. And that will give you, like, if you see that evaluated, you know that it's template injection, no matter where it is, pretty much. And that's really easy. But that has a couple of different things, like your tags have to start and end with the, like your tag delimiter basically has to be the like double curly bracket, which is not always. So you'd have to try a number of different options for various engines that you may or may not be present in that environment. Another option is to look for like variable names that kind of match up. So let's say you're on a user profile page, you could reasonably guess maybe that name is going to be a variable. This is a much less robust approach. It's not really good unless you have access to source code and can see what variables might be present in that environment. This is like shooting in the dark. You're probably not going to find anything. So yeah. Okay. Again, I'm giving you background before explaining exactly why. But I realize that there's some folks who maybe are not super familiar with prototype pollution, and that is going to be important in just a moment when I'm talking about exploitation. So prototype pollution is basically a vulnerability in JavaScript that allows you to modify or access the structure of an object. If you're familiar with deserialization bugs, it's very similar to that, but it's JavaScript specific. So it's usually due to the __proto__ key, which if you access a JavaScript object using that key, it will just assume that you're accessing the actual structure of the object. So here's an example. Let's say object is just like a random dictionary. If you access the __proto__ key, it will just return the object. And this is, unless you explicitly construct a map object in JavaScript, this is what happens when you're accessing a dictionary by key. So these types of bugs show up all over the place. Developers are not expecting this to be a thing. Okay. So again, sorry, that was a very, very brief background, but you don't need a ton of information about proto pollution from this talk. That's probably a whole other talk, and there's a lot of resources on that exist. However, it does present a very fun strategy for looking at JavaScript templating engines. So this is, again, the context from a couple of slides ago. We have our nice little dictionary there with the key and the value, but that's actually not what we have. What we have is this. And this is actually what the object is. It has all of this other garbage after the object that you've declared. And again, this is just because JavaScript is just JavaScript. And that allows us to do this. If we take our handlebars here in this example, and you put the under, proto, under, boom, your template that you think is maybe just accessing a string is now giving you access to the object structure. And that is going to be interesting. That's going to be problematic for a number of different reasons that, again, I'm going to talk about in the last section. So yeah, it's just very strange. For that, we say thanks, JavaScript, because JavaScript is just making our life so much easier, and love it. Okay, so these are all great strategies, but this is a lot of work, and I don't like doing work. So instead, I'm just going to make something that I can just throw everywhere. And I don't know if y'all are familiar with polyglots, but basically the idea is we want to build a template expression that's valid in as many template languages as possible, so that we can just throw it everywhere and it will work for all of these engines. So if you look here, I've explicitly here. So yeah, this is where the polyglot is going to go. This is where our expression will go. And then I have the little template engine name here, and it will be color coded. It's going to be very nice. So let's start. Pug. Pug is a JavaScript templating engine. Used to be called Jade. We have a nice little, we set the variable equal to 7 times 7. This is, the idea here is that this will generate an A tag with, I think it puts the 49 in the middle of it. Anyways, this will output 49 if it's rendered in Pug. And then we can just set up, there's another templating engine called Haml that's built for Ruby. And we can just use this little hash character to make this a valid Haml template as well, which is great. So now this works for Haml and Pug. However, both of these engines are very picky. Both Haml and Pug will get angry at you if you put anything here. So to fix that, I just did this, which basically what I'm doing is I'm saying, okay, this is a 7 times 7, so this is 49, or it's a string, I guess, and Haml and Pug will just be like, okay, so it's 49, right? It's not whatever's after the or. And every other template language will be like, okay, great, we're going to parse what's over here, and we're just going to ignore all of the garbage that you put in front of it because they don't understand Haml and Pug. So it's a nice little trick. Angular is another engine we want to target. Angular has its own templating expression language that's very funky and is great for XSS if you're working with Angular. However, it's also very picky. And so we don't want to anger Angular. So we're just going to put these little HTML comments around this part of our payload. One of the nice things is, though, Angular will also evaluate. There's some other stuff we're going to add in that will just be evaluated by Angular. There's some common structure between a lot of these different engines. So, yeah. So yeah, we just don't want to anger Angular yet. So, okay, the next framework we're going to work with, this is going to be kind of a lot of content going on screen at once, so bear with me. Yeah, so this is FreeMarker. FreeMarker is a Java templating engine that has been around forever. And it's a great engine because you can configure a number of different tag openings and closings. And I decided I really wanted to support as many of them as possible. So here we have the square brackets, which are supported by, again, FreeMarker. We also have the $ double curly brackets, which again is just another option. And then we have the $ single curly brackets. Another thing I wanted to call out here, I also added a little bit of extra stuff for Haml because Haml supports one other format of doing their tags. And I figured I might as well just throw it in there because you never know what's going to happen. But FreeMarker doesn't like that, so I threw in a FreeMarker comment just to prevent FreeMarker from yelling at me. So yeah, this is how we add support for FreeMarker. Yeah. And then here's our great little JavaScript trick. This trick of having the proto expression in your template works for every JavaScript templating framework I've tried it on. So I'll get into that a little bit in a second, but there is a huge number of JavaScript frameworks that will just trust that __ proto is actually a key in their dictionary and allow you to access the object structure as part of the templating engine. So this isn't really dropping a 0-day, but if you want to look at some JavaScript templating engines, pretty much all of them will do this, and there's a lot of fun behaviors that you can mess with if you get that to happen. So yeah, we get some free stuff just by putting in the proto. The other thing is I wanted to support Handlebars. Handlebars has its own specific needs. Handlebars is a JavaScript framework. It's really, really popular. So Handlebars allows you to access the context object using this. So it's a little bit different than the under proto, but it's pretty similar, where it's just evaluating the this expression and returning the current object, which in this case is the context object. So both of these will output the object string that I showed a little bit earlier if they're evaluated by the templating engine. Oh yeah, also, for some reason, Handlebar tries to call proto as a function, which I don't understand exactly why it does that, but we don't want that to happen because it causes an error. So Handlebars will just be like, okay, I'm going to call my own object structure as a function, which is not valid in JavaScript. So I decided that I wanted that to not be how the Handlebars part of this works. So the easy solution to that is just to comment it out. This is a great little, all of these have their own format for comments. So it's really nice for me because it means I can just comment out the stuff I don't want them to think about. So problem solved. Yeah, now Handlebars loves us. Unfortunately, Jinja, which is another templating engine I talked about a little bit earlier, really, really hates exclamation points and will yell at us if we have the exclamation point. So I bet you can guess what I'm going to do next. Boom. And now our exclamation point is valid Jinja because great. So yeah, this will work just fine. Jinja 2 loves us again. Also, I just threw Velocity there at the end. Velocity is a Java engine, and it's just kind of its own monster, and none of the other templating engines care about it. So I just was like, all right, let's slap it onto the end, and we get a free thing. So yeah, that's our polyglot. Good job, everyone. We put together this lovely little polyglot. So this will render in a couple of different ways. We'll either render as 49, or it will render as object. One thing to call out, because of the fact that we have these nice little angular fixing comments here, it may not render in HTML. So it'll still show up in the HTML, but it won't render because it will be interpreted as an HTML comment. But you'll still see 49 in the HTML comment. So if you use this, just make sure that you actually look at the HTML itself and not just the rendered output. So yeah. Okay. So I just gave you a lot. Do we have any other questions about this before I get into the interesting part of the talk? No, we're good. Everybody understands? Okay. Can somebody tell me every character of that polyglot? No, just kidding. There will be a test. No. All right, great. So let's get into the fun stuff. This is how we exploit these bugs. There's a couple of different tactics we have, a couple different goals. We can run code. We can access local files. We can crash the parser. We can gain cross-site scripting, or we can exploit prototype pollution bugs. So ideally, running code is always the most fun and tends to be easy. A lot of these libraries have this really cool feature that will just let you run code. So, for example, FreeMarker, until recently in terms of FreeMarker is a very old system, would just let you call Java class functions. So in this example, you're using a utility and you're calling execute on, you're creating an execute object and you're calling it with the ID function. So that will just execute ID. And they've restricted it a lot. There's now a sandbox that's built into FreeMarker, but it's still evaluating Java objects, which is not a great behavior and has a lot of fun side effects to it. Another example, Pug, which I've mentioned earlier, literally just supports evaluating JavaScript, so you don't need to worry about it at all. This example is from a Black Hat paper from James Kettle, which I'll is linked in my references. So actually, both of these are. So yeah, you can just run JavaScript directly in Pug, which is great. And then Haml is just Haml. It makes it really easy to run Ruby, and Ruby makes it really easy to run Bash. So yeah, we just do equals ID, and it's literally a remote code execution machine. It's great, very convenient. So yeah, those are all easy wins. Unfortunately, or I guess, okay, fortunately, we don't always have this easy access to running code if we have template injection. So local file inclusion is also an excellent little target. A lot of these frameworks will just support importing either other templates or content via URL. And here's a great example of how to do this with Velocity and Jinja 2. So in both of these cases, you'd have your include statement would cause the outputted content to contain the contents of Etsy password. There is some ways to configure these frameworks to not do that. However, that requires a non-default configuration, which is pretty uncommon. So yeah, we can just include Etsy password if we gain access to that. Yeah. So if we are unable to run code, we're unable to, get further access to the file system, one of the things we can do is just blow everything up and shut down the parser, cause it to break. If you're familiar with the billion laughs bug, it's a XML type bug. Basically, wherever you have a point A that calls a point B, and that point B calls a point A, you can just fork off, and you'll have a drastic, very quickly increasing amount of resources being consumed by the system. So I made a little example of how I did that in FreeMarker. You can see that I'm creating these values and then referencing them below, but these values will also reference the value. So sorry, I'm not doing a great job of explaining that. Again, you can find much better explanations of XXC all over the place. They're kind of everywhere. It's not really the focus. But if you can get template parsers or any parsers to enter an infinite loop by accessing resources that have already been defined that then access other resources, you can create a loop that will just increase in the amount of memory and time that it takes to run. So not a great system. But there's usually more fun stuff that we can do with these systems, with these templating engines. Also, a lot of these are used for HTML generation. And one of the things that's worth noting is there's an expectation by a lot of developers that these will automatically escape HTML. And that's true by default. So here we have our nice little value. We can see we take the name and we evaluate it using our templating engine, and it's nicely encoded into HTML entities. But all of these engines also have a nice functionality for people who are not using it for HTML, which allows you to disable that behavior. So we can just disable the XSS escaping. This is an example from Mustache, but all of these frameworks have a similar option for turning XML escaping on or off. Yeah. So this is kind of the more novel part of this talk. And everything that I've talked about prior was pretty well known. You can find documentation. The prototype pollution that we talked about earlier is exploitable in a lot of really complicated ways. And it presents in some interesting ways. So I'm going to talk about like the textbook prototype pollution example. Or sorry, I already talked about basics of prototype pollution. So I'm going to go into more detail specific to this. Sorry. So prototype pollution in this context is more complicated to execute because of the fact that these engines are expecting, they basically have support for calling user provided functions to generate values, but that doesn't mean that you can just call any function with any arguments. In most cases, you're calling functions with arguments that you don't control. And so that leads to a lot of complexity in how you're supposed to exploit prototype pollution in these environments. So the goal in this situation is to either exfiltrate some information about the environment or run code. And it basically requires what I would say is pretty much a gadget chain. It's slightly different from a gadget chain in Java, for example, in that it's not class path, but it's functions within JavaScript that need to be executed. Template frameworks will either, only allow you to read values from the prototype or call prototype functions, again, with their arguments. So it becomes tricky to exploit. But this is every JavaScript framework that I've looked at is vulnerable to some form of prototype pollution. It's unclear how many of those are exploitable, but the number of these frameworks that I found with the ability to just render the object string from under proto is pretty wild. So this is a really good proof of concept that was developed a couple of years ago for Handlebars.js. And I'm going to step through this real quick just to give you an idea of what exploiting these types of bugs tends to look like. So first, we take our value e here and we call .split on it. And what that will do, the only reason we have e as a string is actually so we can call .split. We don't care about the content of e for this example. We're trying to get an array object. So we can call .split on a string to get an array. And then we can push and pop values into the array by calling push and pop. And so in this example, it's calling push and pop to push the string values into what's an array of strings that we've created by calling e.split. And then there's this function string.sub. And string.sub is a weird relic function of string. It's deprecated, and I don't fully understand why it existed in the first place. It will just wrap it in a HTML tag. I think it's an EM tag to create a subscript HTML object. But the nice part about it is it doesn't take any arguments. So it will take the content of the string and it will modify the content of the string without having to add any additional arguments to it. But for this example, we actually don't even care about that. What's happening is it's grabbing the function of string, or the constructor of string.sub. So string.sub is a function, and the constructor of any function in JavaScript is the function constructor, which can then be used with strings. So if you were to, in JavaScript, construct a function with strings, it would create a new anonymous function with that string as the source code. And you can maybe see where this is going, because if we can construct a function with a string source code, as they're doing here, we can effectively create a new anonymous function with whatever source code we want to. And then they're calling it on this value by rendering, I think, actually, I'm not entirely sure about this, but I believe that they're rendering it using this call to this here, which will cause the function to evaluate and output process.env as a dumped string. So this is an excellent proof of concept. As you can see, it tends to be very complicated to exploit these vulnerabilities in this environment because you really just don't have a lot of control over what's being called and how it's being called. So I have also, as part of the research for this talk, identified, as I said, a lot of different libraries that have these vulnerabilities. One in particular I believe to be exploitable and went through the process of reporting. I have yet to actually, the maintainer of the project has not actually released a fix for this. So I've redacted a lot of, or removed or changed a lot of the information that maybe would identify more specifics about it. But basically, this is a hugely popular templating library. Here's the weekly downloads on NPM. This should be exploitable for remote code execution if the gadgets are present, which in many cases, there's a lot of different environments where this may be the case. So this is kind of an example of what my payload tends to look like. Basically, you are grabbing a string object using proto.toString, and then you can call that fixed and .link, which again are these kind of relic functions. And that will output this really nice string object that we can then index to construct a payload. So I will publish some more details on that once the bug is actually fixed. I'm trying not to make the maintainer too angry at me, although we'll see. So yeah, this is a really strange thing, and it seems to be everywhere. So I highly encourage people to go and look at this. I think there's a lot of bugs to be found and a lot of vulnerabilities to be identified with this for sure. So I said, I apologize. I talked a lot quicker than I was expecting to. But I do want to give a special thanks to Tyler Menendez and Student R&D because they've given me the ability to come here and talk to you today. Yeah. I also want to thank Leviathan Security Group for letting me come here during work, so I don't have to be there. And yeah, and also there's some really great resources here. I highly recommend you look at all of these. These are kind of the things that I referenced. James Kettle always does fantastic research, and this Black Hat Talk has a lot of really good details on more classical server-side template injection vulnerabilities. Also, the handlebars template injection write-up. I tried my best to explain that payload. I very well may have screwed it up. So there's a really, really detailed blog post with a lot of information about how they came to find that bug and how they exploited it. And then also, one of the things I didn't really go into a ton is how you can exploit local file read vulnerabilities in some of these contexts for gaining remote code execution. And this is a really nice write-up about that. So yeah, I also used a bunch of these. Mostly these references are like the documentation for the templating engine and like tools for testing it. It's really not that complicated to exploit this. And there's a lot of great documentation on how to use all these libraries. So yeah, we have a lot of time for questions. So who has questions? Sorry, what? Yeah, I'll make the slide deck available for sure. Do we have any other questions? All right. You can contact me on Twitter or my website, and then I'm also on the Discord. And like, I apologize to the talk organizers. I definitely ran way under. Oh. Yeah, that's a great question. It took me, so developing the basic gadget that I showed you here was not very complicated, or this payload, but to actually find a gadget chain, well, so there's two parts of it. One, I changed some aspects of the environment to create an artificial gadget for a lot of the testing that I was doing, largely just because it took so long. I did spend, I would say, probably a month or two of free time developing a gadget that would take indices from the string that's on the, like modifying the string by calling fixed and link to get the characters that I needed, and then construct a string payload to do like the return to make the source code of the anonymous function. So that was a good amount of time involved with doing that. As far as suggestions for how to better approach it, I did at one point see there's been some discussion about using. I wish I had a link to this. There's been some discussion about using CodeQL or SEML or other querying languages to look at structure of JavaScript libraries to try to find gadget chains for other types of prototype pollution vulnerabilities. Also, part of it is really, really library specific. Just because it gets much more complicated to build these chains if you don't have any control over parameters of a function. But a lot of these libraries will have some support for modifying the parameters that are sent to user-provided functions in some form. So yeah, I don't know. I hope that answers your question. Yeah. All right. Anybody else? That's an excellent question. It's certainly more common in Java, right? Like log4shell was the big boy, and I'm sure everybody here is familiar in some form with that vulnerability. But it's not very common in JavaScript. engines. The one that I've seen patched the most is Handlebars.js has had, I think, 5 or 6 vulnerabilities like this that have opened up remote code execution and have done a lot of work to patch various aspects of that. But outside of that, I really have not seen a ton of work. But largely just because there's not a lot of focus from the security industry on templating engines and libraries. A lot of our tooling is focused on cross-site scripting vulnerabilities and more traditional code execution vulnerabilities. And I think that a lot of web is starting to shift in the direction of using templating engines to prevent cross-site scripting and just make this more accessible to software developers. Okay. Any more questions? What's 7 times 8? 7 times 8. Well, that's it depends on which framework you're working with. So are you saying PHP is going to come back? So it is kind of interesting because it's not that different from like caveman PHP, if you're familiar with that, where you throw your PHP inline. There is some discussion about like moving to quote unquote logicless templating engines, which is an alternative to something like Jinja, where you can just run code in the templating engine. And it's more focused on like only converting variables to strings, and in some cases having like basic Boolean logic. But again, if you're using JavaScript, it doesn't matter if your templating engine only looks up the key in a dictionary. It's still problematic because of the fact that like you can just access the proto unless you have explicit checks for that in JavaScript. That was a long answer to a very short question. Ooh, okay. Well, it depends on what you're using WASM for. I mean, if you're talking about prototype pollution in WASM, I actually don't know enough about WASM to tell you that. I would suspect that it's probably less of an issue in WASM because of the fact that you're writing in languages like Rust or C rather than JavaScript, which is really where the prototype pollution design flaw comes from, rather than a lower level like sandbox type bug. However, if you're evaluating templates with WASM, maybe I'm not entirely sure. I think that's a really interesting question that probably requires some more research into that area. I don't know a ton about WASM yet. Okay. Anyone else? All right. Well, I'll be on the Discord, and again, you can contact me on Twitter if you need me. Thanks, everybody.
Who's got Mike? Missing on the stand. Oh, there's a stand. You know, while we make that stand, so it's not going to face. We like Mike.